Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-host, teacher and socialist Andy Lipson and community organizer and socialist Kenny Cepeda. We're online at what-s-left.webnode.com. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode wherever you found this episode. Thank you for that. And jot down our information on from the episode notes. Today, we are joined by the great, legendary, wonderful, informative, and great researcher, Alison McDowell. Thank you for joining us again. She's a frequent contributor here to What's Left. We always love inviting her here. Since we've started our relationship with Alison McDowell, she has brilliantly informed us about many things. Alison McDowell is a mother and independent researcher in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She blogs at the intersection of race, finance, and technology at wrenchinthegears.com. We'll link to that in the episode notes. And again, I remind folks that what began as an effort to slow privatization of public education in her very beloved city evolved into an investigation of globalized poverty management, euphemistically known as social impact investing. And she has spent years researching into predatory educational technologies, harvesting just new oil, right? Data, everything data and blockchain with Alison. Those are synonymous to Alison McDowell. So thank you very much for joining us today, Alison.
I'm glad to be here. I love you guys. I'm glad to be back on a slightly unusual topic.
Yes. Let us introduce that topic then. So welcome everyone again, and we'll be doing it. And this time we'll be doing something different, an in-depth study and analysis of two great muralists, Diego Rivera and José Clemente Orozco. We will be exploring different sides. We'll be exploring Diego Rivera's, as Alison has put it, a techno optimist, and José Clemente Orozco's more techno skeptic, or septic, as some others would say. But this will be a slideshow or we'll be sharing a screen. So I invite the audience that is listening to the podcast to really come over to the YouTube channel or to BitChute or to Odyssey to really look at the visuals here, because Alison has prepared amazing presentation that I think will be worthwhile everyone's time, and maybe to relook at and revisit as we'll be discussing today, specifically on this episode, we'll be discussing Diego Rivera's murals and everything around modernity and technology and his take on the revolution and how it would supposedly have been had we stayed in the technological world, in medicine. So that's what we'll be doing today. I apologize for the clicking in the background. I just turned it off. All right, so let's do this. Why don't we do a quick roundabout sharing why we are doing this? It's a different episode, one that I'm quite interested and also very curious about, but I would like to know from everyone if we can share, beginning with Andy and then Kenny and then myself and then Alison, we'll take it from there, as to why we are doing this, proposed by Alison actually, and I very much appreciated she had said something about it. Why don't we start with Andy? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, well, first off, ever really since I met Alison 2 summers ago, my life has become increasingly difficult with the reality of what's really happening, and it's been a challenge to me being a socialist and me being a Marxist to how to integrate some of the things that I think are happening that she's describing, and we're seeing them unfold in real time, many of those things. And so that has helped. It is, even though it's been distressing to hear about, it's been helpful to not be caught blindsided by some of these events that are taking place. And it's a challenge. And I think in some ways it's forced me to try to answer a question about why did all my socialists go one way? My socialist comrades go one way during this time, and I went a different way. And I do think meeting people like Alison and Jake and others who were looking at this stuff through a slightly different lens is one of the reasons. And the lens that has started to get me to ask is really talking about the means of production. Is really talking. I mean, this word technology but Marxists have a word for it: means of production, the tools that are being constructed. And for the longest time, increasingly, I'm starting to have questions about, particularly as we see these tools go into biotech, and we see the things that are get more and more invasive of humanity and more destructive of humans, I start to question: are these means of production just a neutral thing, like a tipped ball that either the workers will grab or the capitalists will grab in the context of a revolution, and it's just a question of who gets to control them at the end of the day. So that question of science and technology and socialism has really been one that's increasingly on my mind, and I think it led Alison to kind of go down this area. And Alison, if I remember right, you have an art history background. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yeah. So she proposed that we actually discuss this through the lens of two people who are, I think Orozco doesn't consider himself necessarily political in his art, but who would have been on the left, and look at their art as a means of kind of looking at how socialists have viewed technology, and what's another kind of view that could come out of these two figures. I want to say two things. This is probably going to be at least a 2 to 3 part episode. I don't know if we're not going to be able to do it all in one part. At the very least, we're going to try to do Diego Rivera today. And if you are just listening, the slideshow will be in the episode notes. You could go through the slideshow as Alison and the rest of us go through it. So that's another way to do it. But that was what I hoped to do today, and I became interested. And this piece of artwork you see up here is Diego Rivera. It was named Man at the Crossroads of Time, but then later renamed when it was taken down in Mexico. It was made Man, Controller of the Universe. So that's not as good a name. So it
domination built into that.
Yeah, it gives you an idea where we're going on this. So I like to think of this as Man at the Crossroads of Time at the very least. But that's what I would say about this right now.
For me, I think I'm on my own Marxist socialist journey. Some people that have listened to my story, I lived in Nicaragua, that kind of started some questions within me. And then, COVID and trying to inquire into what's happening, what's behind the headlines, what's up with these vaccine passports, what's up with DARPA and involvement behind all this stuff. So it's led me through, to a rabbit hole of technology and in the omnipresence nowadays, and the acceleration of technology in our lives. And so, I have questions, and so I find this conversation as part of that journey, and because I myself, I've always been intrigued by technology. I actually, to relax, I not just technology and science, I actually look at documentaries on quantum physics, or mechanical engineering, or even weapons. Honestly, some of the people that I follow online, actually their background are from the military background in terms of engineering. Mm-hmm. And so again, just jumping back to the journey with you, Alison, I found that there's so many things that I was unaware of, that I thought at face value they were benevolent, or they could be used, just like Lipson said, for the benefit of society. So at the time now, I have more questions about the application of these technologies in terms of not just being a means of production, but actually not so much that as being more means of repression. And so I think it's interesting that you brought these parallels, this conversation, Alison, because it is unusual. It's art, right? But it does represent a vision, or two different visions of the future. And I think that is a question that we're going to have to answer as people who resist, people who question power. And it's sad to see, like we said in other episodes, that the left, by and large, is not just shrugging, by and large, okay, it's happening. And at the same time, there's a sector of the left that is actually welcoming, a lot of these technologies into our lives. And every day, if you're paying attention, there is more and more. We saw a story about Hawaii 4 days ago, where they're using a DARPA, I think Boston Dynamics robot to test homeless people for COVID, right? And then today in Frisco, Texas, they started delivering with Walgreens products. Google and Walgreens are partnering up to deliver products. So what does this mean for us, for our future, when they're also putting guns on these machines? In the context also of, police resisting, mandates. And so I think that this conversation has implication for that in terms of what the vision of the world of the future is.
Well, let's see. I initially saw this topic being approached by Alison on our social media, so she had proposed it, and it's really cool. I just thought I'm a member of 4 museums here in San Francisco, so I love art, and I thought this was amazing that we finally do something like this on what's left, and something that we can explore, something and not so political, no? But as we are doing this, I find that it's a little bit it has ruined some of my love or appreciation for as well for the way that Diego Rivera had seen technology being able to be used so it could be more for a brighter future, more revolutionary future. And I'm excited that we're going to explore this, because it's not something that we sometimes, I think that we don't want to confront that this acceleration in technology and science is actually going to be the destruction of us. No, it's going to ruin us ultimately. And I studied permaculture in 2010, and I still garden. I still do things in projects here in SF, like community gardening here in my neighborhood or in my nephew's school. I still participate and support that. But permaculture is a way to incorporate indigenous and traditional knowledge from all indigenous backgrounds all over the continents, not just in the global south, but all over, even European indigenous traditional knowledge. And it's a way to incorporate that into, as opposed to continuously destroy our earth through Western industrialized methods. And so how do we then, as someone who, I don't label myself, but I know that I'm an anti-capitalist, that's for sure. And how do we then incorporate a world where we can be modern, but also not get so advanced in a way that destroys the humanity of who we are? No, that is, I think, the exploration of all this. It's really trying to awaken a part of us, that hopefully we realize that, more of this tech is actually not that great. Blockchain and data and all of this is not natural to our existence. So I hope that we'll delve into that.
Well, I started down this route a few months ago when sort of an acquaintance I had who lives in the area just shared an image on Facebook from these Detroit industry murals. And it was a panel that was in a series of these 27 murals that were in this garden court. It was the vaccination mural. And it, within the present context, it was quite striking to me. And it made me question, like, what the heck was going on in 1932? That that there's this mural that even at the time caused quite a lot of controversy because of the composition of it and what it meant. And so I didn't know a lot about Rivera other than, sort of leftist and the part of the muralist movement, but I'd never really looked into him that much. And so I started looking around to try to make sense of this painting, and finding out that like his first commission in the United States was at the San Francisco Stock Exchange. And I go, well, that doesn't seem particularly socialist. And then like doing the work for the Rockefeller family. And I'm like, well, that doesn't seem particularly consistent either. And so, sort of poking around in some of these things. And I think I put some things out on Twitter, and then someone messaged me and they're like, do you know about Orozco? And I'm like, I don't. And they sent this link to this very large scale mural series, which is in the library at Dartmouth College, which was put together around the same time in the early 30s. And it's sort of the epic of American civilization, but framed within a Mesoamerican context, which was very interesting because at that time in New England, like they were going through the quintessential sort of, colonial revival-esque, the late 20s and 30s. It was all about reviving the colonialism. And then you have Orozco up in creating this really epic mural series in this library. And so I thought, wow, well, that's quite an interesting contrast. So I pitched to Andy, I'm like, part of the thing I've been struggling with from the left is that when I'm relatively recent to all of this. The last 5 years coincided with my activism here in Philadelphia. And my entry point was more a community reading group that was coming from the Black radical tradition, right? And then it was amplified by, friends that I had who were involved in the Standing Rock protests. So it wasn't a Western traditional Marxist lens. It was an outsider framing. And so I never, because I'm such an amateur at all of these things, like I never really had heroes or things like, oh, you can't touch that because like that's untouchable. Like, so I'm just bumping around into things saying like, well, what makes sense? And a lot of what I felt is that what has resonated with me is this idea of, like the colonization principle, which is very much in effect in the Mexican mural movement, right? And then how that is portrayed then in the United States. And the way it's resonating forward into this new world of fourth industrial revolution, bio-nanotechnology, right? And the means of production when in the synthetic biology world, possibly our bodies become the means of production. And like, not that we can go physically intervene and do work, but like literally our biological processes could literally turn us into a factory. And so that like even built on the work I had done before when I was sort of looking at ed tech in schools saying, they're turning schools into factories. Like these kids are making value for tech companies and, cloud computing companies with their unpaid labor in these schools now. All of this stuff is actually creating value and it's a factory. It's not just a, off the cuff, oh, schools are a factory model of education. Like literally they are factories. And now it's much more even horrific for me to think about the synthetic biology piece. And so when I went back and I started looking into Rivera's work in Detroit, and some of it included pharmaceutical companies, and seeing how far back these systems go. And the more I looked at it, thinking about, because it turns out he actually has quite a number of ties into esoteric realms. The idea potentially the use of art in symbolic languaging and even potentially creating energetic imprints on space around certain ideas and philosophies that resonate forward, and incorporate past history and then resonate forward. So that's kind of what got me started. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's good, Alison, and then we can transition over.
Okay. So, I had this grand ambition, like this would be wonderful. Like we could compare Rivera and Orozco because they seem to have sort of a different view, at least around technology. And then what I forgot to mention too, is the thing I've been struggling with in this past, pandemic era, biosurveillance era, is the role of the material realm and a spiritual realm. Because if we start to, and from the left, you tend to deal with materialism. It's very much a material focused thing. And once you move into nanotechnology, then is that material? Because you can't really actually sense it unless you have electron microscope. Does that count as material? And then where does the spiritual fit in? Because if you're limited to the material realm for your place of engagement and struggle, the odds are not good. So to me, Orozco tips more into some of the more metaphysical, but it turns out Rivera does too. So the materialism and the left, beyond just simply the technology, sort of struck me. So just as far as context, because I didn't know a whole lot, about the Mexican Revolution and the interests that are very much interwoven with the oil interests and Standard Oil and the Rockefellers. But Rivera had spent a lot of his youth training as an artist in Europe and then came back in the early 1920s. And during that time, after the revolution had sort of solidified, Obregón had brought in someone called José Vasconcelos, who was going to head the Department of Education. And at that time, this was someone who felt very strongly about the importance of public art. And the reason that the murals were really central would be that they would be in public spaces and they would be painted. A lot of these were frescoes. So they were literally painted into the material of the building so that they could never be removed and used as a commodity, right? They would never be privately owned and taken out of the public realm and sold off as a product. And so that was sort of the key framing, and that the murals were a central element in educating the public about history and creating these big ideas for large numbers of people who did not have like traditional literacy, that the visuals would convey these big images, these big messages. And so the three main muralists who are sort of widely known are Cisqueiros, Rivera, and Orozco. And so that's sort of this idea of creating this Mexican art form based in public display, sort of epically scaled public displays with an educational purpose. And it said that like he commissioned the painters at Mason's wages. So these were not painters who were lifted up above the workers. They were simply workers who were doing this important task of educating the public and solidifying the ideals of the revolution. So that's sort of how the Mexican muralist movement came to be. This is one of the first ones. This is actually by Fernando Leal, and it was commissioned in, I think, San Ildefonso Preparatory School in Mexico City. And so you can see part of it was unifying the indigenous culture with the Spanish culture and bringing these things together and creating a truly Mexican form of artwork. And so I thought that captured that pretty well. We've talked about Rivera being the optimist, Orozco being the skeptic. One of the conversations I keep getting into with people a bit is around the technology. And a lot of times what's thrown up to me is sort of like, it's not the tool, it's how you use it or who uses it. And so I think that's something I'm interested in talking a little bit about is, Audre Lorde, I put in this quote here about the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So within the context of these technological systems, were these ever the tools of the people, or were they always master's tools? And I don't know that there's any one way to think about that. But I think in the top image, which is from the Detroit industry murals, it's showing the Ford plant. In my sense of analyzing this image is the sort of the power of the worker, the strength of the worker in these systems. And this is an interracial group of workers working together to, progress, right? That is the progress. Below that is a detail from an Orozco painting from 1940. It was commissioned by the Museum of Modern Art, and it was, I think, like bomber and tank. It was a military image. And I pulled it largely for the chain because I tweeted earlier today, I said, I think that Orozco would have a good sense of what blockchain was about. Because for me, that image below, the chaining of people really speaks to the blockchain, where some would say it's just a tool, it's how you use it. And I would say, I don't know, I don't think it was ever our tool. So I don't know, do you guys have any thoughts on the opening introduction?
Yeah, I definitely want to say one thing, because I found two quotes, because I think you said something interesting about the mural movement I didn't know, that murals might be a basis for educating folks. Mm-hmm. And I think Diego Rivera might have thought that, but I'm not sure Orozco would have thought that, because I want to use these two quotes, and I think we'll keep those pictures up there because I think they're instructive. Because here's what Diego Rivera said in many ways about his art and being an artist. He goes, these are both quotes from these guys in the 20s, okay. Not in their 20s, but like during the 1920s.
Okay.
I don't know how old they were. But so it's at the same political time. These are two quotes from them. And Rivera said, to be an artist, one must first be a man vitally concerned with all the problems of social struggle, unflinching and portraying them without concealment or evasion, never shirking the truth as he understands it, never withdrawing from life. As a painter, his problems are those of his craft. He is a workman and an artisan. As an artist, he must be a dreamer. He must interpret the unexpressed hopes, fears, and desires of his people and of his time. He must be conscious of his culture. His work must contain the whole substance of morality, not in content, but rather by sheer force of its aesthetic facts. Okay, which that's Rivera, right? And Orozco said this. He goes, the real work of art, like a cloud or a tree, has absolutely nothing to do with morality or immorality, with good or evil, with wisdom or ignorance, or with virtue or vice. A painting should not be a commentary, but the fact itself. Not a reflection, but light itself. Not an interpretation, but the thing to be interpreted. exclude everything that is not purely and exclusively the plastic geometric language subjected to the inescapable laws of mechanics expressed by an equation is a subterfuge to conceal impotence. It is literature, politics, philosophy, whatever you will, but it's not painting. And in that, I really hear Orozco saying, my art is like I imagine him putting his art on these murals just so it could be art on the walls and people could experience it, and that's it. We're done. I could see Diego Rivera saying, this is for the people. This is to move people in a particular direction, to express what I see in the world, but with an aim towards educating. And I do think there's some difference there in terms of that I want to highlight.
I think it's useful. I mean, I think it's interesting once we get a little bit more into Rivera's life, the extent to which his life embodied that particular quote, if it's early on in the 20s, because the trajectory that he took, I would say, there's one thing to write it, there's another thing to live it. Right.
And one thing that, again, we'll see, and I kept on seeing this in his pictures, and you can somewhat see it in my picture back here, but Diego Rivera draws humans and machines as sort of one thing, almost like they're combined and bound together as if a single organism. Implied in there could be a critique, implied in there could be beauty, and could be a possibility. But I think you can see in Orozco, he does not have that. He looks at it, this is dehumanizing. This is actually humanity getting away from itself. And Diego Rivera clearly does not necessarily see that. He sees in these humans connected to these machines possibility and something else that's possible out of it. And I think most socialists, and this is how I came up in socialism, have that view of revolution, as in humans with means of production moving and getting hold of that towards a new kind of society.
I was going to add a bit more context to what you had said earlier, Alison, which is that, I'm Mexican, so I grew up in Mexico, seeing a lot of the names that are here in the streets and the avenues. And so Álvaro Obregón was a very influential person in the 1920s. He was very much the person who was going to uphold the Constitution that came after the Mexican Revolution. So I'm just adding more context to it. So yes, he did. So I'm just adding context to this. Yes, he did. Had sponsored or had a government that was able to pay for artists at that time. There was a lot of reforms during that time. It wasn't the revolution that Villa or Emiliano Zapata had looked for. He had broken away from those revolutionary leaders, but at that time he was part of the revolution of the Mexican Revolution. He just more reformist more than revolutionary. And so yes, there was a very boom at this time of Diego Rivera's time. There was a lot of art, education reforms, labor reforms, land reforms in Mexico. The relationship with the Catholic Church had also changed at this time. There was more separation between church and state after the 1917 Constitution. And in Obregón's time, it was the U.S.-American Mexican relationship was finally recognized, and there was a more diplomatic relationship between these two, which turned out not to be the best, of course, later on. But I'm just saying that there was this recognition between these two countries, between the Mexican and U.S.-American relationships. And so there was a lot of things happening. It was a golden age, and artists, poets, all of this. People would come from all over Latin America to Mexico at this time. So it's interesting. I think that this will, just adding a little bit more context to this from Obregón. But of course, he wasn't the revolutionary that Mexicans wanted. And lastly, I should state that the Mexican Revolution was ignited largely by the anarchist, I forget his first name, Flores Magón, which he was an anarchist and then will later seek exile in the USA and then came back and organized the labor movement in Mexico. So I don't think we should forget his name. But going back to this, so on forward to this, I just want to provide more context to this. So there was a lot of public murals, and it was a way to inspire the masses. It was a way to be able to share with people what, Mexican society reflected on, or just worker society, really.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to, at least from what I know from the Mexican Revolution, that what followed from that, was 60 years of rule by the Revolutionary Party, right? But ruled by the technocratic class. represented by Diego Rivera. So I think that's also something that has shaped my idea of revolution, and stuff to be aware of, that, and I think we're living through a similar period, but I think we'll get into that later, technocratic dominance over, the peasant, so the Diego Rivera type versus the Villa, the peasants, the people from the El Campo, the fields.
And I want to say, and we can maybe get into this like in the next round when we do Orozco, but part of it is, my understanding is that his framing around revolution was somewhat more skeptical because he was concerned about the violence and things not necessarily ending up the way that it had went. So he was somewhat more reserved about the potential for revolution or what it actually meant. And it wasn't during a military engagement, but I think actually a celebration, like a fireworks celebration of the revolution, that he actually blew his hand off. So all of the work that he did, he only did it with one hand. And so like, it wasn't a military engagement, but it was connected with sort of a nationalist, like revolutionary celebration. And so that's sort of part of his framing, is that, more tempered, I guess, idea of what the prospects of what the on the ground reality of revolution looked like. So, so just as far as context, I'm trying to remember, and maybe I can look into a little bit more, but by the early 20s is where these early commissions were for San Ildefonso, 1922. And then by the late 20s, the work had sort of dried up. And so both Rivera and Orozco ended up in the United States doing commissions. And so most of the pieces that I'm looking at are pieces that were pieces done in the United States. Their body of work is much larger, but focused on those particular pieces with the center point of the Detroit industry murals. So this is right around the time of the height of the Depression. And so just for context is, these bread lines. So in the United States, at least, the patronage of sort of these elite financiers in making these murals and choosing to patronize Mexican muralists and bring them out of their cultural geography-based work and then bring them up into the United States and use them in a certain way to convey a certain messaging, I think was very intentional. And this was happening at the time when, many, many people were going hungry. Fast forward to today's context. This is just our current situation. Again, because a lot of this will be talking about technology and biotechnology. It's kind of like hidden behind the little things, but there's this black rock with sort of toxic cell divisions above it. And that's a detail from the Detroit mural series. And so as we're moving forward, our current contemporary context, pulling it forward, is looking at BlackRock's connection to health investing, Blackstone acquiring Ancestry.com DNA and Black AI, and these, he literally is putting the Blackstones in this the Detroit series. So that's sort of back and forth in this. And this is a detail from one of the murals. Again, and sort of my question is, and Andy, you spoke to it before, it can be read in a number of ways, right? Like there are potentials, or the man is consumed in the machine. And I think within this detail, it's more the latter, the individuals being consumed in this mass of machinery and overwhelmed by it. This is one of the images of actually Orozco's first commission in the United States at Pomona College in California, in their dining hall, which is odd. Like it's sort of a foyer to their dining hall, but it's actually Prometheus. And so I think what we're grappling with is, bringing the fire to the people, right? What does it mean to take from the gods and then bring down? And within this mural context, it is, on the one hand, some people are anxious for it. On the other hand, people turn away, and the navigating of that knowledge. What happens when the knowledge comes down from above and into the human sphere, and how is it managed?
Can I note one thing about this is, since we're talking about Diego Rivera, is and I don't, do you talk at all or mention your slideshow he went to the Soviet Union in like 1927 and 1928. Did you mention that?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can. That's fine.
Okay. Because I mean, he goes there, and obviously it's at the time when the Depression is not quite there, but the 20s is not a good time for many in the United States. Although for his friends, it's going pretty well. And Diego Rivera, right? Because he knows he's connected to some of the wealthy circles. But he's a supporter of the Russian Revolution and goes to Soviet Russia in 1927, 1928, commissioned to make murals there. And apparently it was a very disappointing experience for him to go there. And he actually was kicked out for anti-Soviet ideas and maybe anti-Soviet associations are somewhat implied, possibly with artists at the time who might have been more favorable to Trotsky versus Stalin. But I imagine that was a blow. And I imagine it was, for all the talk of optimism that is implied, I think when there was so much hope in the Russian Revolution that people had, but in the early 20s, I cannot imagine that he went there and was like anything other than struggling with the idea of the possibility of revolution after that, particularly when he's kicked out. So.
Well, part of my question in some of this, and I'll get into like his history, is just how invested he was in those particular ideals, being that during the revolution itself, he spent most of that time in Europe. So he was in his training for like 15 years in Europe. That's a long time. It wasn't like he went for a couple years and then came back. He literally like had multiple partners, children, traveled Europe, like was very, in my sense, like, you know, I don't know how exactly he supported himself, like initially he got money from the governor of Veracruz to go. But there was a considerable amount of time when revolutionary action was taking place that he wasn't anywhere near Mexico. And then later, and so part of it is, I wonder how much of it was opportunistic, like in terms of also that work, because it didn't feel like and I'll have some images later that he did watercolor sketches, but no, it seems like if you had a certain experience, you would incorporate that more directly in a more formal way into your body of work, which I don't know that happened, but let's see. This is talking about, this is the Prometheus mural in the hall at Pomona, and it's sort of a description. And I do have, for those of you guys who want to look at the slide deck, like all of the sources are here, so people can, part of the reason I have such a big slide deck was I was really interested in it. And so I wanted to create like a giant bibliography of material, because people might go back and have, you know, a different analysis. But the idea of, you know, the humans, you know, just living their lives, and then some people accepting this new knowledge and some people turning away, and life goes on, people are messy, and there's this great sacrifice, and it doesn't really, like for Prometheus, it doesn't turn out very well, right? Like he does this great act and then his future isn't so great. And I think in many respects, and maybe that's some of the bitterness a bit in his tone earlier, is that I think he felt like he had certain ideals he was trying to convey that didn't land. And he just felt like they're not getting what I'm saying, which, you know, I can empathize a little bit sometimes with that. But like, he's got this knowledge, he's putting it out, they're not getting it, whatever. Like this is Prometheus, and this is sort of the framing. And then let's see later on. So this was this is later. So Pomona was the first. Then he did some work at Dartmouth before he did the whole mural project. He came, initially they were looking at wanting Rivera, and then they pivoted to inviting Orozco instead. And so he did a few paintings before he started the mural series. He's already talking about the creative man escaping the machine, and a lot of the images are similar to what we saw in the bomber tank mural from 20 years later. And then like he was more of the skeptic. So let's see. So in the late 20s, you know, he's working with Dartmouth. He's looking at the reign of the mechanistic principle. And this image over here is actually from a later mural in Guadalajara at the Hospicio, which was an orphanage and a hospital, and where elderly people stayed. And this was in their library. And it's quite crazy, but this is actually Cortez. And he's very, very clear about his position on technology by this point, that there's an angel up here that is a machine. It's a mechanical angel that is whispering in Cortez's ear as, this death and destruction is being wrought on, the indigenous people of Mexico. And there are other images in this series that actually have like two-headed horses with a robot dog that is very similar to Boston Dynamics robot dog Spot. I mean, it's the eerie how close he was. Yeah, Hospicio Cabañas in Guadalajara. So I'll just read it. It said that his work resonated with Louis Mumford, and it says, as Mumford wrote in 1934, war, mechanization, mining, and finance played into each other's hands. Mining was the key industry that furnished the sinews of war and increased the metallic contents of the original capital hoard, the war chest. And on the other hand, it furthered the industrialization of arms and enriched the financier by both processes. For Orozco, as for Mumford, industry and domination were two sides of the same coin. Mm-hmm. And for me, my framing in terms of understanding it towards present day technology is that most of this technology is war machine technology for what it's worth. It's coming out of, and some of it is being birthed out of academia, but a lot of it with corporate finance that is tied to the war machine. So,
no, I think that's an important point. Look, at one level, I hear about these things, implants that'll help paralyze people, or something else that'll help people see colorblind. Go from being able to distinguish colors. But you've pulled back to where all these things start, and it's like what Kenny said. It's DARPA over and over again, and those are they seem to want to conceal what the real intentions of these technologies are, hidden behind seemingly these side products of benefits that have nothing to really do with who is the original initiator of the ideas and what they're really being made for.
I'll point out there's one other quote here. I pulled some of these really long pieces, but it talked about that. It says he was a humanist whose vision of the future entailed liberation from the factory. Mm-hmm. So to me, that's a different version than a typical left version, right? Yeah. It's the idea, like, if we have a cooperative, if we run the factory, if we have, then it can be good. And he's saying he sees the factory as something that can't be a benefit for society.
That's different. Yeah.
It's very different.
I'd like to just point out how he saw Hernán Cortés coming over to the Americas as that representation of just colonization, capitalism, but as the industry and domination. It's like, this is what tech was going to bring, no? And it so happens to be Europeans, white, but I think that Jared Diamond, the author of Guns, Germs, and Steel, really talks about the reasons for why these continents were fated the way they are, because of just the resources that they had. And so it's not necessarily that it's inbred or inherited because they're white people, but rather because they also had indigenous people in their lands, but rather it's more of like the reasons why they had the resources that they had, like steel and guns and germs, and be able to colonize different countries. But the fact that they came over and Orozco saw that as that is what technology is going to be for us is interesting to me, in the way that I didn't think of colonizers or I didn't think of the colonization of the Americas as the technology is going to do that, just that, destroy us, and going to defeat us and our humanity of who we are.
Yeah, and just if I understand this right, Orozco is not talking about 10 years from, like, if he's doing this in 1930s, he's not talking about what's coming in 1940s and 50s. He's saying this view of capitalism is what is happening exactly right then. He's not predicting Boston Dynamics. Like, and I can see it now that something's weird going on. But if you would have asked me to have this view back in the 30s and to see the 30s as it's being constructed as essentially, what's this guy's name again? Cortez coming and killing humans, like that, in the creation of industry in that way, that is definitely not how, like, we as Marxists talked about it. And it's pretty interesting to me that he had that foresight, because it's easy for me to see that process now. I don't think I would have seen it back in the 30s.
And we are now behaving, all of us here in this society is now behaving as worshippers of like the accelerated tech and accelerated sciences, no, and wanting it to come, and yes, it'll release us or free us, or almost this innocence of this naivete that we are as just accepting everything that's coming our way. I see it a lot on the left, embracing so much of surveillance, so much of, you know, the new era of tech, and I mean, we haven't learned really from history.
You know, I've been diving into the rabbit hole of free will, you know, and like the two spectrums, right? At the full free will, and like no free will at all in society. And so just in that context, I'm looking at Cortés here. Even he himself, you know, is not like a person that has free will, right? Someone else is indicating instructions.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is a chain of command, even the robotic looking Cortés. And so I find that very curious, because in the context of, you know, who decides what technology is for. And so it seems also, you know, he's making a commentary of, you know, it comes from a superior power, you know, of sorts, that is abstract in a way to me.
But one of the other things that I've been looking into more lately too is the idea of like consciousness, because I feel like really what's happening is a battle for consciousness, or understanding mind and where consciousnness lives and how to engineer it. And looking back even to, I found out about this person, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was a Jesuit priest he was spent 20 years in China and like was part of the discovery of the Peking man. And he was an early father of AI, like theorizing AI in the 40s. And he essentially created the idea of the noosphere. So this idea of sort of like a collective consciousness like around the world. And so, you know, just thinking about like the angel, right? But is the angel, like you get entangled with ideas, and is it an angel, or is it a frequency that there's this noosphere that like tags into your mind and your consciousness, and then you can choose how to engage with it or not? And yeah, it's a good question, Kenny. I don't know about the whole free will thing. I can sort of picture that angel as the noosphere and some sort of predatory energy, you know, dangling, you know, messing around in your mind and seeing if you'll bite on it, you know? All right. Well, here, I'll keep going. Let me see the next. Okay. And so this is just an image of a detail from the Detroit Mural Project. It's a small image at the end in one of these sort of narrow bands, but it actually is speaking about globalization. And it builds on the previous slide talking about sort of domination and resource extraction. That literally, they were already, the River Rouge plant of the Fords, they were looking to control all the raw materials. So they would own all the mines, all the lumber, and on the right-hand side, this is the Brazilian rubber plantations. And then on the other side are the docks. And it's fascinating to me that the fish then turn into boats. So that the fish in Brazil turn into these mechanized boats on the one hand. And then you've got the freighter, which was very early, you know, in terms of global transit. And literally this thing that's from the curator at the museum described it as being based on an Aztec life and death mask, that there's a face, you know, a face with flesh on one side and a skull on the other, and the star in the middle. So to me, it's very clear, the predatory nature, the intended predatory nature of resource extraction. Now, the curators always spin it. They say, well, it could be good, it could be bad. It just depends on, like, you know, how you use it, or what the future holds. If it ends up being a bad thing or a good thing, maybe it could be good. But literally, the guy who's harvesting the rubber looks like emaciated, and it doesn't look. I mean, and in fact, on this dock, it almost looks like a gun out there. It doesn't look promising.
Yeah, and it's important to remember, I think, also that for all the people revolutionaries at the time, they're in the 30s, in the 20s and the 30s, who would have even had their criticisms of the Soviet Union. One of the claims that they make of the superiority of the Soviet system was its growth in its economy during the same time when the so-called capitalist countries were in the decline in the 20s and 30s, that they did not see themselves subject to the business cycle in the same way. And that became later people who would then, and this was true for Diego Rivera. Diego Rivera was like, yes, Sputnik, Soviet Union is better than the United States. And so that view, that's not just Diego Rivera, that was an entire view of all communists, Trotskyists, Communist Party people, or Trotskyists, to basically those who were supporters of the Soviet Union or critical of the Soviet Union were saying there is something better about the way that the Soviet Union is run based on the fact that their productivity in relationship to the productivity declines that were being seen in the United States at the time and the rest of global capitalism. So even revolutionaries were keeping score through a process of who's doing more of the stuff you see in those murals, essentially.
But it's very enigmatic to me, this particular image, right? Because there's nothing heroic. I mean, and this is being prepared for the Ford company. I mean, they're the uber capitalists that makes it look like an empowered worker in this particular image. I mean, when you're putting like a death skull on the top of the thing, I mean, it could be that he's just showing that capitalists are not good, but I don't know. It doesn't really looks like it's looking like worker power to me per se. But I found this as an interesting image.
I think to me, sorry, that last image, it speaks to the present. We know that we're emulating nature, right, to replace nature of sorts. Like making drones everywhere, and that transition.
Biomimicry.
Yeah, and so I just find it interesting, that it's that notion is not new. We think we've progressed, but this notion of emulating nature to replace nature and dominate nature, and basically coming in, like I don't know if Alan Watts, I heard him say something along the lines of there is a massive difference between thinking you're of this world versus you come into this world. Because if you come into this world, you come to dominate the world, versus if you are of this world, you're part of it. You're part of the ecosystem. And so I do hear what you're saying is I found myself making that same argument, in my younger Marxist journey of, just elevating the Russians' prowess in achieving technological progress in such a short time, despite the having lost 80% of their industrial capacity in the Second World War. And so again, just not even interrogating whether that technology is conducive to a better life for humans, because because even that productivity came at a great cost of human in nature. And so I do, now seeing this gives me pause into questioning those, that approach of elevating technological progress as equating that to human progress, to betterment of society and lives in a better future.
Well, and for me, it's a lot of like the anthropocentric focus too. I mean, which is different than, like you said, being of the world, being integrated with all the other beings. Like that tree makes me really sad, to go make a bunch of tires to put on cars. This is just a little bit more introduction. We'll go into this a little bit more later, but within the Dartmouth mural that Orozco had, they were talking about the dehumanization of the human spirit, and particularly in schooling of cookie cutter children. And so that's why I think having a second episode focused on Orozco, this one is going to focus a little bit more on industry and labor. But I think that the Orozco conversation, especially in looking at, because I do think he was actually more of an educator. He had very clear ideas of what he thought about education, whether or not he thought of his art as being educational, and maybe there's a difference there. But he has a quite a biting critique around at least the academy and formal education. So the idea of technology creating these cookie cutter children and mass conformity is part of the technological system. So we'll go into that more in the next issue. But
which is what our schools are, no, Alison?
Pardon me?
Which is what our schools are, no?
I know. I feel so duped. I mean, I didn't know, because like you're in the machine, and while you're in the machine, you fight to save the machine, right? I mean,
yeah,
that's where you are. So, you know, and this is from the Dartmouth mural, again, Cortez and sort of the epic of American civilization, and you know, the colonization, and the ships are burning, and then the new era has come, and you can sort of see the machines there on the right hand side of that image.
Mm-hmm.
But this mural here on the left, actually, it was mostly, I think, painted by George Juan Crespo de la Serna, like one of his assistants, but he conceptualized it. And I thought it was really interesting to me that he chose centaurs. So if you picture the Prometheus is the central image, and it's in this alcove, and there are these two narrow panels, one on either side. So one is Zeus and Hera going, oh my gosh, you know, took the fire and gave it to the people. Our time is up. And then on facing that is sort of the agony of the centaurs. And it's quite shocking, actually. Like, I don't see a whole lot of art that really features the centaurs, but they're being wrapped in a serpent. And this is like a centaur mother and a baby centaur, and they're being like burned up and like grotesquely, you know, squeezed to death. Like their age is up, which ironically is that we're now moving into the age of the centaurs, which is the human machine hybrid cyborgs. So I wanted to sort of point out the resonance of that imagery. Okay, so the image, the vaccination panel. So this is what did it for me. This is sort of what got me started on, was someone posted this image. And it's very strange. I mean, if you imagine, this was part of this Detroit mural series. It was in a room that was formerly a garden room in the museum that he was given over by the Ford Foundation, Edsel Ford. And this is one of the smaller murals. And in this, I sort of have an image. I'll talk about this a little bit more, but it's shaped as a nativity scene. It's quite creepy because there's actually like a dead animal under this sheet here. You can see their little feet. I don't know what kind of animal, and these animals were for the serum of the vaccinations. And evidently the pharmaceutical industry was a major industry for Detroit. I had no idea. The Park Davis Company. But as we consider vaccination today and the larger context, it got me thinking I spent some time in Austin a couple weeks ago with Jason and my friend Lynn, and we went around to all these places. And one of the major forces in nanoelectronics is this guy, James Tour, and he has patented laser-induced graphene. He's like, I can turn anything carbon into graphene. And then we know that graphene is being used as an adjuvant in a variety of, it's being explored for its use in vaccinations, if not. People have done investigations of the current ones, but there's much material about it being used as an adjuvant. And so I got to thinking, and our pictures are kind of covering it over, but there's part of it is they make graphene in these furnaces. And so I feel like symbolically there is a connection between sort of transfiguration, the crucible of the furnace, and the transformation of humanity in this centaur-like age that's coming. And so there's a detail here from one of the industry murals with the furnace, and I'm sort of equating it a little bit now with the graphene furnace and the graphene in the vaccines. But this was sort of the main image that drew me in and said, well, what's going on with Rivera with this image? So I don't know, do you guys have any initial thoughts about it?
I mean, this just shows to me the admiration of science that Diego Rivera had. Now, there's another mural, I forget when it was done. It was the Cardiology Mural. It was a mural on the progression of how the institution of cardiology, it picks, I forget the details of it, but maybe we'll post it here and insert it somewhere if you want, Alison. But it just shows how Diego Rivera had this admiration towards the sciences. No, that's what comes to mind for me. I just also feel sometimes the neglected part of all this is just how much of experimentation was done, as we know historically, even before. In Germany, for example, on peoples and on Jews, the experimentation has done to advance technology, right? And people forget that so much suffering has come because of it.
Just real quick on that, experimentation has happened and is still happening.
Yeah.
I mean, the most obvious one, obviously, there was a story that broke out about the CDC funding, puppy experiments on dogs that are bred and they're held in these cages so they get eaten alive by these insects or whatever. But the point is that this stuff is still happening. There's obviously side effects for people in studies, and so people are still subjected. People in life in general, I think, still subjected to cruel, and questionable tactics in the name of progress in science.
Well, I would go a step further than that to say that literally yesterday, when the EU, when the vaccines were given to approval to be used on 5 to 11-year-olds, emergency use authorization, these COVID vaccines, the people in there said openly, we will find out if they work by essentially we're doing the experiment now. We have to put it into the kids in order to find out if it's going to work or not. And that's openly said in the FDA part of the FDA discussions of this. So I look at this thing, and it is what Eduardo said. It is, and I don't just think of this in terms of Diego Rivera. I am looking at this through the lens of socialists and Marxists of the time, and I think this is literally, what's that called? This is the Nativity Scene. There is a reverence for science, and you see it here. And those 3 guys back there are the 3 wise men, and these animals are the barn animals. And there is Mother Mary, and the father is Joseph or whatever. And there's the baby who's being vaccinated is young Christ. And that's the notion. And what that guy is doing with the microscope is he's essentially looking deep into the insides of a dead animal to find out more. And so, I mean, look, if this last 2 years hadn't happened, I would have had a different view about this whole thing. But this is it. This is what we're seeing, and it's and this is the socialists today are literally praising these vaccines as modern saving us from death in the same way that this painting is. And so I think it is important to see that continuum of the left, of people who are trying to fight for revolution, getting caught, I would say, in a trap of essentially, what is it, praising and praying, creating a religion out of this tool, which was an experimental tool being used on humans, which itself displaced other medicinal ways of treating people, so. Yeah, it's very striking, and I feel like it's very revealing in that painting.
That got my attention. Let me see. Okay, so this was very controversial at the time, and ironically, because now the Vatican is the one that's pushing all the transhumanist technology, biotechnology, that the various religious leaders were outraged. Now, I think in a certain extent, and actually it's interesting because this last paragraph, and Ford played it up, they loved this controversy. So I think that there's a certain amount of showmanship for some of this stuff, and I think if you consider that perhaps some of this is propaganda and energetic imprint, getting this attention. And in fact, perhaps that composition was meant to draw in this energetic attention onto this installation, achieved its goal. At the last paragraph of this newspaper article talks about in the biography of Frida Kahlo, that they described in the incident where the churches and everyone were protesting this particular panel, the vaccine panel, that the factory workers volunteered to stand guard, which left Rivera euphoric, right? So the workers stood in and said, no, we're with you on this, right? And so again, in a strange twist of fate, because now clearly most of the churches are now aligned with the biotech industry. But there, in that moment, there was this sort of materialist version versus a faith-based approach that now everybody has sort of consolidated and everybody's pushing the same thing. But I think from the worker thing, it's consistent back then. At least that's according to the story. That's how the story goes.
Well, I would say that story of what happened back then, workers versus people of faith, we are seeing this replayed in education with teachers basically drawing up petitions to have young people vaccinated, and parents trying to save themselves from that. And so I think there's a parallel.
Yeah. And so this quote is just sort of introducing sort of the heroic labor, and we've talked about this a little bit before, but the idea of engineering and industry being progress, right? That you can honor the labor, honor the peasants, and then move them forward into this new technological age. And that he was drawing on, Aztec culture, sculptures, which is something he did very much in all of these U.S. compositions, about bringing it forward into this technological age as a framing around that the past could be fused with this futuristic approach. So, and again, like, to me, the fusion, right, of this futurism is this an empowering composition? It's 27 different murals, including 2 very large scale on the north and south sides of the room. And this is a detail of that. But the question is, if you're looking at it from a Taylorist standpoint, the assembly line standpoint, what does this mean for the worker? And I think these people further up, I'm trying to remember, there's something, their skin is green because they're being exposed to some sort of toxic poison. That's why they have a green tinge to them. And a lot of these individuals actually are in protective gear in these sort of gas mask frameworks. So I'm going to go through a couple more and then we'll pause. Mm-hmm. So the River Rouge plant was almost a city unto itself. And it was a center of really modernizing the assembly line. So I was interested in looking back to what that actually meant at the time, because of Fordism, right? We all know it's the Fordist age, right? You pay people a good wage and then they can buy your cars and buy a house and, live a comfortable life and everybody's happy, right? But the reality was that when they first started the assembly line, the workers found that the work was really boring, and that people didn't want to do this work, and that the assembly lines, it was drudgery, and then they would speed up the lines, and it was dangerous, and the things would fall apart. But then once they got them to $5 a day and profit sharing, well, then people were willing to sacrifice their autonomy as workers for the money, right? For the payout, for the financial payout. And it was framed as, Ford being so benevolent, right? That he wants to share the wealth and have lots of contented workers. And so that's sort of a bit of my question. I would maybe go back here, just what you guys think of from a worker organizing standpoint of what does that imply about the workers and about the work, the nature of the work itself?
Well, first of all, this painting is very beautifully done. It's very detailed. It obviously reflects what society is like across cultures. It's whether you're in China or in Latin America or in Europe, or this is definitely a reflection of how workers are. They are the backbone to our society. It is what creates what we have, but at the exploitation of the hands of power. And so I just wanted to say that there is the workforce and the power that we have as workers. It's just, I think we undermine ourselves as like bees or ants, that how much power we hold. When I see depictions of workers like this. It's just so much that we can do if we really did if we organized in a way that that is able to defeat those that exploit us. That's just my comment earlier. I was going to say that my commentary to this painting.
I think to your question, Alison, like what I see here is a collective process, but not a social process. Because every worker is under task, and they're kind of, yes, they're present in the room, but they're focused on the task, and so they're, in a way, they're just in addition to the machine, for the machine to keep working. And you said, that they sacrifice their, in a sense, I see it as their humanity, in order to participate in the option given, because it's either do that or go and get another crappy job at the time. And I think that by and large, that is still the thought that dominates us here, that on the left, that, the fight for just wages. Wages is the end goal, increase the minimum wage. But that is not going to fix the systemic thing that, that we have to challenge. And so, as a Marxist, I mean, I don't see a solution other than, obviously there's much to think about, because it's not just about taking the means of production. It's like, what kind of society alternatives in the productive process can be brought, what technologies can actually be kept, and if they should be kept. It's not just about taking over the means of production. And so, because personally, I want a world, not that, I don't want that world. Hell no, I don't want to work in that factory. I don't want to go to Amazon. That's what you get at Amazon, right now, and even more because they're surveilled and more precisely and insidiously exploited. And so I'm afraid of that world. It doesn't look like life to me.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that Diego Rivera is doing some interesting things here, because I do think he's doing what he said he wanted to do with his art, which is he is showing what is, but he's also showing, like, you can see that individual guy's face on the right, and it's not like there is an individualism that's somewhat shown in it, and he's also showing the dangers of the work with the people wearing the masks. I do believe embedded with this is still that sense of possibility of what workers could collectively do if unleashed, and Marxism does talk about power. The power of the working class is its ability to alter its environment for itself, to fit for itself. And I do think that Marx also talks about alienation and, like, workers who are essentially forced to do the things, but they can't make decisions about how they would do it. I think the question that comes to my mind is would workers, if they were given the choice, would they choose to do it this way? Because that's, to me, the thing about socialism is about people having choices, and about even collective choices and deciding. The question is, would non-alienated labor choose to arrange themselves, produce things in this sort of arrangement? And if they didn't, then this has no place in our future. If they did, I don't know, because then look at those people who have to, like, have green skin. And socialists have answered this question like, oh, we'll have robots do that part. Like, that's how, but again, we can see that there's no free lunch here. So I like this painting because it does show me that Diego Rivera is being true to his art, because he's not trying to gussy it up. But I do think it raises as many questions as it maybe tries to answer. The last thing I'm thinking is I've always thought about cyborg as just human cyborg, one human being increasingly mapped onto a machine. But I feel like this vision of ourselves as a society is almost a human social cyborg, where humans become more enmeshed with machinery as the process of production. And I'm not sure that's a good thing either. So I don't know, just another thought.
Well, in the future, everyone's going to be a soft robot They're going to sit on their sofa and run the workers, right? And they're going to give you an AR tablet that say, push this button, right, for this week. Next week, you're up in the, the gas chamber. Then you push that, but actually you don't even, they're going to save all that money because they won't need the gas masks for the robots, right? But then I guess part of me is like, these are cars, right? And so it's about and cheap cars, right? That's the idea, is that everybody gets a cheap car. And so the idea of this, the reason it's so gargantuan is because it's feeding this giant system, right? That's supposed to keep growing so that it remains profitable. And so to me, that's the implications of consumer durable goods and the environment and, what are we making? And, in some ways you could say maybe cars are better than the people in, China who are making plastic, holiday decorations or something that are meaningless, that maybe a car has more meaning, utility, but, the scale, right? The massive scale. And maybe, compared to, they always talk about the enclosures, right? The cottager industry, where you actually had control over multiple aspects of the process. And then once people ended up in the factories, that was all gone. They lost that leverage. I don't know. I mean, the thing is, it's a diverse group of workers that's pointed out, that's part of, the narrative, but, I guess who's being uplifted here? Is it Ford for having such a wonderful factory, or is it the workers? And I don't know, maybe it's unclear.
I think Diego Rivera is clear that it's the workers, it's the power of the working class here, but there still is, yeah, but there still is what workers would want for our future if we had real true choices about how we lived our lives? Is this what we would choose for ourselves? And I think there's a in the same way that the vaccine is being raised up in the previous panel, this factory is being raised up. And again, we have to counterpose this factory model as if, well, once workers got control of the factory, it's all good. Then this process now becomes a clean process versus, and I don't just mean environmentally clean, but almost like it becomes an enriching process instead of a degrading one. And I don't know if that's true. I don't know if workers who would be working in such a situation would be like, well, I didn't like doing this under capitalism, and I'm not sure I like doing this under socialism. Even if would we vote to put people in this sort of situation? And would workers say, yeah, this is what I want to be doing? And I have a question about that.
Well, it's interesting because that article, which is actually from the Ford company, was they didn't want to do it until we paid them $5 an hour. So profit sharing, They didn't really want to do it.
That kind of answers the question. That sort of answers the question.
Sorry, we have a neighbor who has a really loud dog. So assembly line. Okay.
It sounds like a bloodhound.
It's some kind of hound. It's a big hound. It comes about every night and it walks around and howls. So, well, this is just going back to means of production again, right? Because that's the factory. That's a certain kind of factory, a car factory. But now literally they're talking about these biotechnologies turning our bodies into the factories. So I don't know if there are people who are just listening versus watching on YouTube, but, this is from an article from Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology News. I'm trying to think of it's fairly recent. The title of the article is Enabling the Body to Manufacture Its Own Medicine. And the sentence that I pulled out is, in other words, mRNA is a disease eradicating platform that transforms each person's body into its own therapeutic or vaccine factory. So to me, that's the thing I can't quite get a handle on, the left not understanding. They're literally calling your body a factory. like once you go to that point, how are we not applying those principles of means of production to what is coming through the biotechnology space?
I feel like it's the same thing as what we just looked at, which is, I think for me, you're right. the more that we've gone deeper down this rabbit hole that capitalism has taken us down, the more it's caused me to fear what the world we're being driven into. And it's caused me to relook at that old picture of the factory of humans and it's caused me to question, wait, if I reject this notion of my body becoming a factory, well, then do I accept that workers, we would want to work in a factory? And like you said, when they were presented with that work, it was boring as shit. It was dulling. I think that work's going to be dulling under any circumstance. I don't think you can make that interesting under any. So would workers say, yeah, let's do that? And I don't think they would. I wouldn't want to do it. I would want to do something that's enriching. And I can't imagine anybody who doesn't want to be enriched to say, let me go back into that factory doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. So yeah, I think socialists have fallen for the same reason that we looked back on that and we're like, yeah, if we could just get control of this thing, then it'll be all good. And it's not something I don't think we're not allowed to get control of it. These technologies are being produced as our prison, not as an option for liberation. And Cortez keeps coming back over and over again in my mind.
Yeah, I'll never see Cortez the same way. I no longer see him as a white colonizer. I see him as a technological colonizer.
And that article is 2016, by the way. I can see the date. It's very tiny, but
thank you.
That's how they view what they're trying to do. Like that really is their vision of how they hope this thing operates when it gets up and running. And that's what they're doing.
Revolutionary, Andy. Don't you see? Truly revolutionary.
No, but these spike proteins that are being expressed on the surface of our cells are the vaccine products, and our cells are the factory for these spike proteins that are then we have antibodies. So this is what's happening. It's not. This is now.
Yeah.
Okay, new means of production. Pay for success in bioreactors. So this might be a bit of a stretch, but I think it's interesting. So just bear with me. Because I also think that Rivera was probably involved in a lot of sort of spiritual and psychedelic practices. So who knows what kind of time traveling he may have been doing. So on the top of these two major panels, the north and south walls, they have figures that represent the different races of people and colors. So there are these large sort of blocky abstracted figures. And above each or below each figure is a narrow panel that actually embodies a certain mineral element. So there's the red people, right? And the red people are over iron, and that's what these really fractal sort of crystals are underneath. And then you have the black people, and the black people are over coal. And then on there's white and yellow on the other wall. I'll have an image of that later. But you can see the volcano and these hands that are coming out of the volcano holding the black rocks, right? The black rock, black stone in the hands. And then underneath they're underlaid. It's sort of like the people are rising out of these mineral beds. And so to me, especially the iron and these, I think dodecahedrons, I don't know, and people who are better with math might know better, but it relates to his cubist practice. But to me, that feels like a nanocrystal technology, like presaging what is coming within these bioreactor spaces. And that people are essentially of these minerals, like they literally are holding them in their hands. So there's a very direct connection between the human body and these minerals that are the minerals, all of which are used in production of cars specifically. So the iron, the coal, there's limestone, and I can't remember the other one on the other side, but he specifically chose these materials that were used in the factories. So for me, like they're literally looking at like crystalline nanotechnology and DNA crystals. Okay, so this is the white figure, and literally you can see at the base these crystalline structures that are underlaid by the limestone, and you have more hands, but they say in this image, the hands are like in fists and they're angry. They're not just holding the rocks, they're angry. But the idea that literally living tissues are being used to create these biohybrid materials and nanotechnological materials. There are two articles here. One is called 3D DNA Crystals and Nanotechnology. And the date on that is 2016. And here's one called The Fascinating World of Functional, Hybrid, and Biohybrid Materials, which is July of 2018. So literally they are, I think what Rivera is talking about speaks to the idea of a biohybrid, right? Like that living tissues are of minerals, vice versa. There's this sort of it isn't discrete, that there is a blending of that, and that is part of the industrial fabrication process. DARPA, we've talked about DARPA has come up a number of times. This is from the DARPA website where they're talking about living foundries, that the Department of Defense wants to have certain high value molecules, and they're looking into creating synthetic biomanufacturing. So they're looking literally at growing these bio-nano materials within living systems, which I think mostly they sort of frame as like, oh, we're going to use it in yeast or these like very basic, like, single cellular organisms. But there's nothing that says that they're not planning on using it in more broadly. So I'll just read this last paragraph. It says the ongoing Living Foundries 1,000 molecules component seeks to further refine this initial capability to decrease the cost, improve the scalability, and expand the complexity of engineered systems for biomanufacturing. Efforts are focused on using automation, novel genome editing tools, and machine learning technologies to alleviate the challenges of prototyping. As proof of concept, DARPA aims to produce 1,000 molecules and material precursors spanning a wide range of defense-relevant applications, including industrial chemicals, pharmaceuticals, coatings, and adhesives that can be customized to continually evolving DoD needs while ensuring continued leadership of the U.S. in the rapidly evolving field of synthetic biology. So part of what, like this just goes back to the mRNA, is literally what they're talking about is using our bodies as factories, creating nanomaterials, various sorts of biohybrid materials within living systems, whether those are living tissues of plants or microbes or potentially people. But the factory model, and as Orozco had referenced early on, it being embedded in the defense industry, to me is really important, because what was happening in the 1930s, the early 1930s, is the early advent of electron microscopy and the role of the Rockefeller family, particularly, and Rockefeller medicine in molecular biology. And to me, that approach of looking at life from a molecular standpoint, from a standpoint in which it is simply a material that can be engineered, which is, a hop, skip, and a jump to it can be fabricated in a factory. There is nothing spiritually connected to a living system. It is simply just a collection of molecules that can be used in a certain way. Oh, okay. So I'm going to see if I can play this, if this is loud enough to play. It's a short clip that I did about Ginkgo Bioworks. It's about 3 minutes, I think.
Ginkgo Bioworks, it's one of the largest synthetic biology companies now. They have these series of literally like biological factories. They're called bioworks or foundries. They're all based in Cambridge, single cell biology in a massively parallel fashion. At the end of every workday, they might be behaving slightly differently than they did at the beginning of the workday. How we think about the future of investing, multiplicative effects of all of these different like exponential cost curves colliding in such a way that you get totally freakish and alien output.
Ginkgo Bioworks is building a horizontal platform to program cells for every type of application, from pharma and biotech to food and agriculture and even consumer product.
Right. So if you take a bite out of that Impossible Whopper at Burger King, it's going to bleed hemoglobin, which is what makes blood red, which you don't really find at high levels in plants, into the burger. So where does it come from? Well, they took brewer's yeast, like the yeast used to make beer, and they program it like you'd program a computer.
That platform really has two parts: their code base of cells, enzymes, and genetic programs that they use to jumpstart new projects, and Ginkgo's automated foundries.
Foundries and this concept of programming biology is foreign to almost everybody. We jointly developed the concept of a cell program And they'll continue to develop that using code base from our collection.
That code base is a long-term competitive advantage for Ginkgo Bioworks, with over 440 million proprietary gene sequences acquired so far. Ginkgo will organize the world's biological code and make it useful.
And then bring a lot of concepts in: robotics, liquid handling instruments, wide array of sophisticated machinery and instrumentation that we use to amplify and multiply what our scientists are able to do in our foundry.
So Ginkgo's business is, we program cells project with Moderna last March. We're like an AWS for programming biology. McKinsey projects $2 to $4 trillion for cell applications. So Ginkgo Bioworks makes money in two ways: when the robots do the actual work, and then through a revenue sharing model. When you invest in Ginkgo, you're also investing in the clients they take on.
It's zooming into Moderna. So I mean, I'm curious what you guys think, because I've had that clip for a while, but I think if Rivera were commissioned today, it would totally be like Ginkgo Bioworks saying, like, Rivera, like, look at our factory, look at our robot workers.
Well, the first thing I would say is, can we go back to the picture with the hands and the crystals?
Yeah.
And again, I'm looking at this through the lens of contemporary Marxism that I was brought up in, which basically, I can see how Rivera is fusing humans with machines and saying in the proper structure, in the proper kind of society, that can have a liberatory effect, that fusion, that social cyborg that is being created by capitalism. And similarly, he's kind of saying that there's these things inside the earth, these powers, these almost like that. These hands are like the Prometheus. These hands are able to find these magical, or these crystals that can be turned into magical things if we can put those things. And it's humans that are able to unlock that. They're the sort of Promethean gods now who can turn these four different materials of the earth into these wonderful machines. Okay, in that case, maybe it's not cars, maybe it's something else. But in the end of the day, we still again have to remember all this stuff gets turned into World War II tank production. And when I look at this Ginkgo thing, it just reminds me of the 2018 Department of Defense National Defense Strategy, which basically was saying that the future for fighting China is we have to understand that biotech and big data analytics and things like that are going to be the way. Those are the developments we're going to have to lead on, the United States, if we're going to be able to compete with China. So I understand that all these things are being put out again as something that could have domestic use. But all of these things, I keep seeing them ultimately only through the lens of war and of war making. And that was really put through with that one part you read from DARPA, which is like they understand what this stuff is about. And so they go, look, all this stuff is basically, even the vaccine right now, which is spike proteins on your surface, all those technologies are ultimately so the U.S. who controls one can make war with somebody else who's also trying to do the same thing.
And there's a lot of money. That other bit about Ginkgo Bioworks, it was like, look how much money they can make. They can make it while the robots do the work, and from all of these licensing of essentially life, like genetic material.
Yeah, I mean, I just can't escape the whole link between colony. You brought this up in a previous episode, Alison, about imperializing our very small parts, the molecules, our cells. I also remember reading something from Microsoft where they're working on basically using our body energy, right? Like the energy that we produce for data storage, basically. And so because, apparently data requires a lot of energy to be stored, this processing, rooms increasingly, as they collect massive masses, they're going to need a more efficient way of storing stuff. And so obviously to someone that doesn't have the context, it sounds so crazy, but there is a financial application here. Obviously, capitalism. There is a monetization of this stuff. This stuff is not just to make our lives better. As again, that's the way it's sold. All these technologies, they're sold as potentially for the betterment of humans, and that's what we thought of the internet, right? And it was going to democratize our society and open channels of challenging the status quo, and we're seeing that is the opposite. It's actually our sense of the world is a lot narrower. I think for a lot of people who experience the world through media and through devices, our sense of ourselves is also being lost. And so again, brings me back to that question of free will, and can we exercise free will when we are so polluted, and so immersed into part of the machinery? Can we lift our head up? Can enough of us lift our head up and say, is this worth it? And that's the question that I have as a Marxist, right? Who sees power in the hands of the masses, the people that produce. But increasingly, I don't know. I was very optimistic, but it's hard when these technologies are just amusing and actually kind of exciting for people. And they're welcome as a tool of liberation. I have a friend who's constantly calling me a caveman, insulting me because he works in biotech.
Oh,
Wow. And I'm sorry, like, I love you if you're listening, but and I use this, it's kind of an insult, honestly, and I call button pushers. A button pusher does not know what the masters know. They don't, just like that military person that you guys interviewed here. The button pushers don't have a sense of the strategic nature of the technologies that are being pushed. So in obviously, they also I think, I don't know if I'm correct, but something along the lines of 30 to 40% of our economy is related to national security, quote unquote. The national security industry. So again, in order to change this stuff, right, you have to have an alternative to people's livelihoods. Shaming and antagonizing is not going to work. You have to have alternatives and solutions because, again, as a materialist, fundamentally we want to survive. And our very survival, attached to this machine. I don't think people can see beyond, being attached to this machine. And so then we are just mesmerized. And I do think, at least people that I talk to, this stuff is too hard to process, too hard to understand the implications. And I'm not saying they're idiots. It's just hard, to be able to lift your head up and say no. And especially when it comes at a great cost, and in time is of the essence. These technologies are advancing exponentially in ways that we can't even wrap our heads around. This is just opening more questions to me. All these, because there is more. I thought, okay, I was thinking of the insidiousness of developing us as batteries. Basically, look at the Matrix, that movie, right? And then I'm finding out there's way more technologies that I'm not even aware of, coming live into our lives. And, when we talk about AI, we don't even have a sense of how insidious AI is in our lives. And it has been. It's been around. Yeah. And so, yes, it is a race against time. But I guess the question I have is, like, do some people just want to stay connected to the Matrix, the machine, rather than fight the machine? And I don't know. That's just like a philosophical question that I have, and that will need to be answered. I'm going to do my battle because I don't want this life. I don't want to be mine. I don't want to be the resource, to feed this machinery to produce profit so a few can live like kings or beyond kings, like extraterrestrial beings with superpowers. And so that's just the stuff that this evokes, all these technologies, imperialism of the body, of our cells, of our molecules, of our minds, of our consciousness, of our spirit. and so again, and I don't know, like, I don't know, that's why I do this. So maybe someone will have some different answer, different questions, because I have more questions now.
My comment, I guess, is just short. To Kenny saying that, like, I think the battery image of the Matrix, the films, I think there are imageries and there are science fiction dystopian novels today, there's dystopian films today being created today, where we are seeing that we are ourselves a resource that's being commodified, that is being exploited, that is being used, that is being, like this depiction here where different races that representing different elements of nature. And it's weird, no, I don't want to almost say it, but could AI life potentially turn on us and we be used? I mean, is that something that we can? It's hard for me to fathom, but I feel as if with the recent discussions around aliens or extraterrestrial beings, it's almost as if it's opened up my mind to be able to have those discussions, that we could potentially be used as I remember, as Isaac Asimov's short collection of stories of science fiction, where robots turn on humans and humans are now being used by robots. And we ourselves, we are a resource ourselves. Like, this is, as this mural is being depicted.
I have a lot of concerns about the alternative energy movement. Increasingly. Yeah.
Are we the new renewable energy? Are humans it? We've been trying to figure it out for so long. It's finally come.
Well, there's all this conversation now about decentralized grids and the blockchain, and and they all talk about solar panels, but I'm like, I think it's like a hop, skip, and a jump from the solar panel to the smart shirt. We already had that conversation a bit ago,
Just one last thought. And again, in all this, I see this continuous push for something new, something better, something, the eternal growth, right, of that capitalism basically summons into the world. In the same question applies to technology. Like, do we need more of this? Why? Why do we need more of this? Because at least the question on the left, again, is generally, how do we harness new technologies? So that's how the narrative has been driven to, right? Even on climate change. How do we harness new technologies? It's not about stopping production, right? Like the incessant production that we have. It's just, how do we better adapt? And then, again, it's not a question of, that's enough, like, stop. There is plenty for everyone.
Right.
Well, I mean, I think, again, the answer that socialists have always made is that organizing the workers as a collective and socializing production, which looks like that Diego Rivera painting that we saw 5 things back, has essentially created the basis for producing enough so that people can have the things they need to survive, and to do it in a short enough time so that people can actually rule collectively together, like, have an actual democracy, as opposed to having to work so hard just to kind of stay alive, kind of thing. That has been the statement. But I got, like you, Kenny, more questions for me come out of these sorts of, particularly as things progress in our current society, as the means of production increasingly look like the way Orozco has depicted them, then the question becomes, like, can these swords be turned into plowshares? Because all of these things really are swords. They're made for death. They're made for killing. They're made for competition over resources. I mean, as those forward plants are going forward, the U.S. is already laying plans for how they're going to control oil in the Pacific and how they're going to control oil in Europe and the Middle East. So that all this is happening, like, so none of this. So all this production was, are we immediately, because of capitalism exists, are we all then strapped to our machines forever because of the things of productivity? If that's the case, I don't know, man. I just don't know. So it just raises a bunch of questions about because again, the center of revolution in socialism has been getting control of the means of production. And if I have a question, if it's going to be that simple, is it we have to destroy the means of production and then reform what we want? I just don't know. But that's a central part of the way Marxists look at it. And if the means of production if those means of production are all constructed around one aim, which is killing and competition, can you really turn those things into life things? Can they just be tilted? Can they be used for a different purpose if their purpose was only one? I have a big question about that.
Well, one of the things I just want to add in as someone who's like not a long-standing leftist is just that more of an indigenous worldview resonates with me because it's the larger complex relationships of humans within the other living systems. And so if you're planning an economy, is it essentially around human need, right? And that for me, the frame of what is it to be a good relative, not beyond humanity, in that balanced place. And then would you want to plan all of that? And then would that make you God, or some sort of techno God decide to plan the whole universe? That's the man control of the universe, I guess. That's kind of maybe what he was saying. So anyway, that's kind of one of the things that I think about. Just because some of these things sound super outlandish, like within the context, I was looking at crystals and like piezoelectric, because I have to say, about 3 years ago, I met Rouge, and he does a lot of work around geomancy and crystals and sort of doing this artistic interpretation and this sort of like decolonizing work. And I was, my first thing is like, crystals, I don't know, I wasn't a crystal person really. Like now I have like my little crystal necklace here somewhere, but like I was like, and then I got to thinking about how much of technology is really crystalline based. I mean, literally it is crystals. It's refined in certain ways, but it really is about crystals. And so I was looking at some of the history because I do like to sort of look back and see where things came from. So in this sort of 1920 to 1940 timeframe, which is when these murals were being produced, like what was happening with crystalline technology, and among those included like work on materials testing with ultrasonic waves, because I think a lot of what's coming, what we're experiencing now, has to do with frequency, and like crystal radios. And following the World War I, it talks about classic piezoelectric applications. Now we're hearing about human piezoelectric energy harvest, but some of those applications included things like microphones, accelerometers, transducers, bender element actuators, phonograph pickups, and signal filters. And so these things were already in the works in World War I, and then sort of further developing, although that they had limited commercial production. But the idea of using crystalline technologies within the context that might seem kind of far-fetched, but it was within the technological framework of that era. So I just wanted to make that point. And this is an image that I've used in some other slide decks, but I kind of imagine like the post-Fordism, which is where life itself becomes the car on the assembly line. And then instead of the workers, they're all replaced by robots. And that we're all being systems engineered on Kenny, this speaks to your free will conversation. Like, do we have free will, or are we just on somebody else's assembly line, and where the hell is it going, right? Can we be the car that gets off the assembly line before the end? Maybe or maybe not. But like, to me, that encapsulates what it is when the means of production become our own bodies and our own social relations. Because it's not just our physical, within the context of pay for success, which is what we're talking about too, is the enclosures also happen to get woven into all of our social relationships to one another and within our communities.
Yeah, and I think there's something important to know about crystals. Like, this was a big part of my research, actually, was turning, in order to get the in order to see what proteins look like at a molecular level, we had to make crystals out of the proteins. And so what was that? So on the surface of it, I have a new ring, right? And I've got I'm married now, and it's got a sapphire on it, and it's beautiful. And you can look at that blue sapphire and be like, oh, that's so beautiful. I mean, and that is the reason that some of the people like it. But what's important about it for science are two things: are the order. It's ordered and repetitive. And what it allows you to do is whatever signal is sent, then each molecule or each thing inside that order will send out the same signal at the same time. Like they'll all be a chorus. This allows you to amplify a signal. And that's really what's the inner part of what makes it so useful for capitalism is not its beauty, it's not its outward beauty, but the fact that everything's in order and it repeats itself in 1 dimension, 2 dimensions, and 3 dimensions over and over and over again. And the more order there is in a crystal, the more it is just a repetition of the same thing over and over and over and over again, like a factory plant, then the more useful that crystal is for the capitalist, because whatever signal you send into that thing and whatever transformation takes place within that crystal, it will be the same transformation. It will send that signal out in a single sound, amplified, because everything was in the same structure, in the same order. So everything gets seen. And that's exactly what I was doing. I was hitting these crystals with X-rays in order to see the scattering of those X-rays by each of those protein molecules. So from that, I could unpack what it looked like and what those proteins looked like at the carbon, for where their carbon atoms were, nitrogen atoms, oxygen atoms. So again, I don't know, man. These are weird things.
It is. No, I didn't know that was your area of expertise. That's pretty cool.
X-ray crystallography.
It almost sounds like the way consensus is manufactured, and having people repeat the same thing over and over, by being exposed to traumatic stuff.
Yeah, and the reality is not much of what is life that we consider life is crystalline. Is not order, is not the same thing over and over again. Of course, crystals exist in nature; they come out of. But most of what we understand of life doesn't have those features to it. It's unpredictable, and it's distinctive in its difference, not in its commonality, and so.
You think about the standardization, even in education, to scale these things globally for the process, they have to be standardized. There has to be the repetition, the replication.
And there is a way that culture is. I feel like when I think about what a crystal is, there is a way that society feels like we are being turned into a human social factory, a human social crystal, so that we are all the same. We all say the same thing. We all think the same thing. And we all can be harmonized to a particular order that can produce an outcome.
But even crystals have imperfections, no? Like there are diamonds and all kinds of nice, beautiful rocks that aren't necessarily used in today because they're not the standard, right, of beauty.
Right.
So, but yes.
The rough ones get thrown to the side or polished.
Okay, so this is interesting. So I found this gets a little bit on the esoteric side, but I found it really interesting. So in one of the images, and I'll show it later, there was like a compass point in this mural, and I go, well, that really looks Masonic. I'm just kind of curious, is that like a Masonic symbol? And then I found out this whole article that said, well, Rivera wasn't actually a Mason, but his father was like the 33rd plus degree Mason, and the person who delivered him as a birthed him, was there at the delivery of him was a Mason, and all the people he hung out with in California were Masons. So I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. And then I found out that he was one of the founders of the Rosicrucian order in Mexico City, this lodge, this Quetzalcoatl lodge in 1926. So this is before he comes to the United States, but pretty early on in his career, at least in Mexico, in the mural movement, because that started in 1922. So within 4 years, he is a founding member of this lodge and created a painting of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, as sort of the emblem of this lodge. So what are the Rosicrucians? So essentially, it's sort of this ancient mystery school, like this mystical, and this is where I find it interesting, like how much of Rivera, the image that we're told of Rivera, is actually the full breadth of what he was. Because if the left aspect is very materialist, it seems like increasingly a lot of his work was metaphysical, like was beyond a materialist framing, and that he was blending these two things. And so this order goes back to ostensibly ancient Egypt. It was through the Middle Ages, and then clearly, like, he established this in Mexico City in the 20s. There's actually quite a Rosicrucian presence, like in Quakertown, Pennsylvania. They have this whole temple thing up there, but there's actually a major Egyptian museum in San Jose, actually, of the Rosicrucians. Like, it's a central area. And so after he was trying to come back into the Communist Party, like, he had to explain himself, which I guess makes sense if you're looking at things from a materialist end. They're like, Rivera, what the heck were you doing for 25 years with these Rosicrucians anyway? So when he wanted to come back in, it's not Christian per se. It literally is this sort of ancient mystery school, and it's connected in some ways to alchemy and symbolism. And so I think, to me, it's especially given that he wasn't just incidentally a member, like he was a founding member. He created the imagery for this lodge in Mexico City, which is, a major lodge there. The idea that you would contain knowledge in symbolism or like hidden symbols within the imagery. So I know sometimes maybe some of the stuff I'm going to talk about in the images in Detroit might seem a bit of a stretch, but I think that we probably need to understand that he was very familiar with the idea of embedding symbolic language and messaging in his images, because his paintings are very detailed. I mean, Orozco is a bit more like fluid in less detailed, but Rivera is very, very detailed in terms of like, here are the 5 things on this table, and then you get to figure out. So it is quite like a puzzle in there. So like to know that he was connected with this particular order that was trained in symbolism, symbolic language, which is not unlike information technology systems, really. You just have to know how to decode it. But central to this mystical order was the idea of consciousness. And that consciousness is kind of, to me, on the polar opposite end of molecular biology. Like an engineered mindset that you can take molecules and put them together and program matter is very different than a mystical alchemical consciousness scenario. So to me, that's very interesting, these two backgrounds. And this is just, again, from this history of the Rosicrucianism, but the idea of alchemy. There's a global network of people who are very interested in these other sorts of alternative science investigations. They go back to Paracelsus, Bacon. I mean, these are major players in sort of medieval and early modern history that he is affiliated with. So I think it's nothing that we should just like dismiss out of hand. And someone shared, this was on Twitter today, but like this idea of an Athenor, which I'd never heard of, but was an alchemical furnace. And like this image is like all the little black stones going to feed the alchemical furnace. And so I started thinking like alchemy, like some of it is spiritual alchemy and the alchemy of the soul, but could nanotechnology, like could this idea of biotech or molecular biology that's evolving into this nanobiotech space be today's equivalent of an alchemical process? And then what is the role of the uber capitalist, hedge fund investor class of BlackRock and Blackstone in running this transformational furnace, which is not unlike the graphene furnace and the furnaces in the Ford plant. And so when later he goes and he does his first commissions in the Bay Area, this is Rivera in the Bay Area. But this is a major museum in San Jose, the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum. Like it's not, I mean, not that Google, but like many people think that this is a very esteemed, it's not a flaky, just side of the road attraction. It dates to 1926. So, it's an hour outside of San Francisco. And the idea that he has founded this Rosicrucian Lodge in Mexico City, and then he suddenly gets transported up and is working with all these Masons in San Francisco. there's no way that I think that he doesn't know about the individuals who are involved in this circle. Even though an hour by car today is probably a little bit longer in the late 20s, like it's not so far if you're coming from Mexico. And then additionally layering onto this that San Jose is the county seat of Santa Clara County, which is where all of the Pay for Success finance pilots are happening, and where the legislation that was the first corporate personhood tied in with the railroad system happened in the 1880s. So there's these layers of history overlaid on top of Santa Clara County and San Jose and this Rosicrucian. So within these grander, like sort of metaphysical worlds, there's the Gnosticism, this idea of having gnosis and light and spiritual awakening, and looking at Rosicrucians as being Gnostics. The Gnostic Gospels is this idea of like the world of oneness, and that there is this Sophia that essentially wanted to like give birth outside of the process and created this material reality that was sort of an abomination that became the demiurge. And so I think that there is this tension between spirituality and materialism, that in many respects, Diego Rivera's work in Detroit, in the Detroit murals, is weighing these two parts, the metaphysical, the material, the consciousness, the machine. And it's this interesting intersection. And so, I was looking like, were the Rosicrucian Gnostics? And they're like, well, they kind of pretty much overlapped. The Rosicrucians didn't think the material world was so terrible as the Gnostics. The Gnostics thought the material world is terrible. We just got to get out of here as soon as possible. But the myth of Sophia was that the fall wasn't Adam and Eve, but was what I was saying. She was an eon, a divine entity descended from God, and they were like angels, and that she was the child of God, and she was within this pleroma, the Greek for fullness, the heaven. Like, so everything in before the fall was all together and happy in the pleroma. And Sophia wanted to have a child, but she conceived without a male partner. So it's a non-traditional conception process. And that this child became the demiurge, which was this misshapen creature, and that she cast it out of the pleroma, out of heaven, and that became the material world, and that it was not a good world, but within that there were sparks of the divine in the beingness of the world itself, and that was the fall. And that eventually there was some reconciliation. But this idea of Sophia, the goddess, the original fall, the casting out of the demiurge. And I think this is important because this Sophianic myth in the Gnostic Gospels actually relates back to Ethiopia and what Cardano and Hanson Robotics are doing, blockchaining all the people in Ethiopia. Like, I think that there is actually a Gnostic mystical connection to these early stories of how the material world came to be. So part of the reason I bring this in is when I first looked at the vaccination picture that someone had posted, this is a very small panel underneath. So if you can imagine, the structure of this room has, it's tripartite. There's the upper panels, and then there's a narrow layer, which is where the carbon and the iron crystals were. This is that equivalent narrow layer. And then there's sort of the major sections with the very massive murals. So this is one of these small detailed layers. And when I first saw the vaccination picture, I said, what is that? Like, I kind of put it out on Twitter and I go, what is that thing under the vaccine? And it wasn't this clear. I didn't have a good enough detail of it at that point. And I'm like, and then someone said, it's the demiurge. And I go, what's the demiurge? Right? Like, what is this demiurge? Because I think in some respects, like, we're moving into what is life, what is creation, what is man, what is machine, what is engineering, what are minerals, what is this hybrid? And within Rivera's life too, and I will touch on this in a bit, but like Frida Kahlo, because of her health consequences, like had a number of miscarriages. And so there's this element of reproduction process, both in their personal lives and then writ large, that I think has implications for synthetic biology and what it means to play God and create life. Now, this is framed in the traditional analysis of this, the mural construct, that this is a healthy embryo, and that is surrounded by disease, and that thank goodness for the vaccination process and modern medicine that we protect these embryos. Now, I will say, to me, it looks like the colors that they use in the minerals and the cubist crystalline kind of structures are feeding that embryo, and that there is no other human body attached to it. Like, there's no woman, there's not a human process connected to that. So when I think about it possibly as a demiurgic figure, like this sort of thing that was cast out that might create the material world, especially when the material world is these minerals, I mean, I think it's an interesting interpretation. Can I say for sure, like I said, they frame it as modern medicine, that this is just embryos in modern medicine. But within his backstory of the material and the metaphysical, to me, it seems more significant, because it's almost like we're fighting over life itself. I don't know if you guys, that's kind of a lot. I don't know if you have any response to any of those things.
Who is the painter of this?
This is Rivera.
This is Rivera. This is
yeah.
interesting.
This is right under the vaccine.
I've never seen this.
I don't automatically see it surrounded by disease all around. I mean, some of those things just look like what are normally just the way that magnified biology looks. It doesn't to me, at least I'm imagining this when they're saying surrounded by disease, it's all those cellular things on the outside, correct?
Yeah, the outside. Yeah. I mean, this is from their curators, like what they say about it.
Right,
so I think this is how they framed it.
I mean, the thing that comes back to me is that because this is now this mural, is it connected to the people with the hands and their crystals coming up? That's a different mural, isn't it?
It's on the same wall.
Okay, so this is it. Yeah. So if this is part of that same mural, it seems to come back and imply that the power that he's describing that's going to be harnessed by humans in factories as they strip out the energy and the resources of the earth, that same power is actually is a power from which humans come. Like those crystals right there, to me, I imagine, are not different than the ones that those human hands are holding up later. That's one implication that comes to me. But I don't see disease on the outside. I just see a hidden world that's being exposed through magnification, and like that. This is the biological world that we live in. I don't know what that thing in the center is that's got these spikes coming off of it. That the developing fetus is growing around, and so that's what comes to mind for me, at least.
Yeah, but there's not a mom, really. There's not a. It seems like it's being nourished off of the minerals, not. I don't know. There's not. I don't know.
Yeah, it doesn't.
It gets more interesting. There's another piece. Let me see if can I. Okay, this is just a quote I pulled, but it was talking about the Gnostic Gospels and the idea of matter and form being illusions or the shadows of spirit, and that the eternal is sort of created through light and existing in mind. So again, mind being a unity in all beings and objects consisting of mind substance. So it's the idea of matter, like what is actually matter and what is mind. And I think to me, some of this comes back to the nanotechnology space, is that when someone tells you like this oak sofa that I'm sitting on is mostly empty space, you know, it feels really hard. Like I've like knocked my shin on it a couple times, but that it's really open these just molecules, right? And so if we can't sense that with our current senses, but if you had access to sort of the microscopy, you could blow that apart and say like, no, at a molecular level, there's a lot more going on here that is not how you see it with your senses, like that, and that who creates matter? Like is matter, and how is the matter built?
And just to be clear, like this description of the world, which basically says there is only one substance. Matter and form are merely illusions or shadows of spirit. that is the opposite of how Marxists construct that matter and form are the preconditions from which ideas, and that's out of which ideas emerge. So this is more Hegelian, I guess that'd be described in, so that's just what it is.
Yeah, so it's like the mystical, like Gnostic Rosicrucian model versus the Marxist model. So that's to me one of the things I think is kind of interesting. And so, again, I've mentioned this a couple times, but I think he's weighing these two sides, one of which is examining in partnership, because this is happening, actually, the people who brought him from Mexico early on, even though I think his first commission was in San Francisco, he had a show with the Museum of Modern Art. It was actually the second independent show that they hosted. And Abby Aldrich Rockefeller was the individual that was sort of was the patron that enabled him to come to New York City. And while he was there, they toured him around the Rockefeller Institute and all of their labs. And so he literally had access to some of the highest technology at the time. And I think that's important. He's not just making this up or he's read it in a book. He had access to the power center of the people who were driving the version of medicine that was focused on a technologically, highly advanced technologically framework for understanding living systems, which are his patrons in New York. So I think it's interesting to me. This just gives some of his background. I did not actually realize, I don't know if you guys have heard of like the converso element, but I hadn't either until I stumbled across Rivera. This is actually his biography from the Jewish Virtual Library Project. But the conversos were the people of Jewish faith who were force converted during the Inquisition. And then over the centuries, their religious practice was suppressed to varying degrees, and there were various campaigns of the Inquisition, like ramping up and then quieting down. And quite a number of them then later moved into Amsterdam in the Netherlands after the 80 Years' War, I think, in Netherlands broke off. And then they played a major role in maritime trade and the financial transactions. And then through that, a lot of them actually within the conversion process became the Jesuits were the ones who were very accepting of the conversos. And so within Latin America and the missionary project, people who were looking to leave difficult situations then went to Latin America as Jesuits. And so evidently, based now on all of the genetic testing, they're saying like up to a quarter of Latin America, like based on genetic lineage at some point has converso DNA, like genetic heritage, which to me is actually quite interesting. And even up into the southwest in New Mexico, it's quite a burgeoning area now that they have the genetic testing. But it's this idea of sort of the fusion of Jewish faith, conversion, missionary, Catholic, finance, artistry, power systems. Like it's quite interesting to me. So anyway, I did not know about conversos, but Rivera was within that. And so then he was born, trained as a painter. The governor of Veracruz sent him to sponsored him to go to Europe. He had quite a number of dalliances and various things in Europe, and then learned, worked in Cubism and a number of things, studied frescoes in Italy, and then eventually sort of came back in the early 20s. And so in 1907, the governor of Veracruz sponsored him to go. Which is interesting to me, like how you came into these connections, that the governor would be like, oh, yes, we will send you abroad. You must have these connections. And again, his father was a high-level Mason. Now this, I would be interested if you guys are familiar with this, because I was not. But looking at the public health systems in Latin America, and I was trying to look into the role of Standard Oil and the Rockefellers in the oil industry and the revolution, because I think there's been some uncertainty and investigations into the role potentially of the oil industry in financing interests in the Mexican Revolution, because they had these oil interests that dated to the late 19th century, and their primary goal was some sort of stability and people that they could work with to secure their assets in terms of oil. we know that the Rockefeller Foundation, like they created the first school of public health, which was Johns Hopkins. They did a lot of predatory things in Puerto Rico around the same time. They actually, there's a really interesting article here, like promoting the Rockefeller Foundation, but was saying, they were speaking here, Eduardo, to what you were saying, or Kenny, I can't remember, but like that the revolution did not manifest in the ways that people thought, right? Like it was not as, it was more reformist than truly revolutionary. And what the Rockefellers did was that they funded an anti-yellow fever campaigns in key areas, essentially to provide the government with funds to provide some public benefit around health that would lift up the government as supporters of the people in ways that they might be more likely to question them, but then they gave them something like, they gave them financial resources that the government did not have to create an outcome that people felt was beneficial through the yellow fever campaigns, including in Veracruz, which is where Rivera was growing up, and was actually a major influence in the Mexican health system. So I think the colonization aspect of the oil industry's interest in establishing their presence in public health in Mexico, especially at this time of transition, and establishing a new government that they could relate to and that they felt might be open to their oil interests, to me felt really important. And I know that later, actually, Rivera, and it might be before he went to California, because I couldn't actually find images of those pictures, but he did a number of paintings for like the Mexican health department, or like Department of Hygiene, that were cellular related, like that they were these early, like he went into the United States already predisposed to having a certain level of interest in medical, the intersection of art and medicine. Can I let me just read this one paragraph. So the Rockefeller Foundation was vital in legitimizing the position of the new revolutionary Mexican state, since the foundation's campaigns were instrumental in presenting the Mexican government as a motive force in the improvement of the health conditions of the population. The control of yellow fever was presented and perceived as a major manifestation of the Mexican states being congruent with the principles of the Mexican Revolution and with the constitutional commitments it made in 1917 when it promised universal health care for Mexicans. So this idea of universal healthcare systems was, I think, from the outset interwoven with the global North's financial interests in establishing its presence or in access points in Mexico. Mm-hmm. And Rivera, was an actor in that space in conveying art, using art to talk about public health and lift that up as an area of public concern and interest.
This, again, another example of how public health and public safety is used as an access point for, having a presence of these capitalist institutions, and how, I don't understand. I don't know the degree of involvement besides, setting up that, yellow fever campaign, which, brings up questions, in the context of COVID, how was that played out? Was that actually, happening? Was it a public health crisis made up in order to create consensus in the population, as the state being a force for good, right? For their own good, for their public safety. So these are just questions that come up, but nonetheless, again, you see the presence of these non-profit organizations in an imperial impetus, and I see that all over the countries I've lived in, been at, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Mexico, and so that's what comes to mind, just like public health as an access point to, influence.
Yeah, and for me, what comes up when I think, because I've seen the same things, and it's true. Like if you look at the Chinese Revolution that Mao Zedong led, you will see the hands of Rockefeller, you will see the hands of U.S. capitalism in that. if you look at the Russian Revolution, you will actually see the hands of Rockefeller. You will see the hands of the German capitalists in the events of that. And people trip about that. And I don't trip about that because the world that Diego Rivera and Orozco, they are, even if they have different visions of what they're describing, they are looking at a world immersed, if you will, interpenetrated by essentially, in my mind, a capitalist world, but one populated by humans. And so what do people imagine that any human activity that we do, whether it be individual or collective, is not going to have some interpenetration with people who are looking to do ill to it, to direct it in some other way? Why would they not? My problem sometimes with where some of the folks who write these things is they write out essentially, even if I don't think the Mexican Revolution produced the kind of revolution that it certainly didn't produce the one that was going to create the kind of history that the people who were struggling for it were trying to make, one that where they were self-directing their lives for the rest of their time. And they had that vision for all of humanity, I imagine. Like, it wasn't just for Mexicans. I believe that many of them were probably animated with the idea of world revolution, even if they weren't socialists. And so I feel like what starts to get written out by visions that say Rockefeller comes in or Soros comes in or US comes in starts to write those people out of history because they lost, and they did lose. They did not achieve the aims that they ultimately needed to achieve, and we know that because here we are sitting about to be having everyone being data mined by these people at the top. So that's my problem, is that if we change the world, if we are capable and are able to change the world, we have to understand we will be doing it with the fingers of our opponents deep in our work, deep in whatever we do, trying to misdirect it and redirect it. It's just that if we are able to kind of create a world that is actually free, they will have failed. It won't be because their fingers aren't in there. It will be because their fingers are in there and their fingers weren't enough to stop the world we were trying to create. And so that's my one issue I take with not you, Alison, but this is I see this all the time with people kind of going like, well, they did this and they did this. And this was all just a psyop that. And I'm like, what gets written out of it is actually the intentions and the actual actions of people who were trying to change the world. Yes, in some cases, and you can see it also in Nicaragua when people talk about the movement against Daniel Ortega, and they talk about it as only being directed by the CIA. And when I know the CIA is in there, I know it for a fact, but that doesn't change. It doesn't change the fact that there are people there also who have a different vision of what they're trying to do, even if the US has got its fingers in the pie. Because if we change this world, I guarantee you, European capitalists, Chinese, US, all in our stuff. The question will be, will we be able to make that change despite it? That's what comes up to me, at least.
Well, I would say, I mean, for me, the reason I think it's particularly relevant is because they were working specifically in Veracruz, which is the governor of Veracruz sponsored Rivera to go be trained. And then literally the Rockefellers brought Rivera to New York. And then I'm sure, like, working closely with Ford, like when we're looking at the vaccine mural, the idea that their interests were not simply oil interests, but literally public health interests who were directly in the geography where he was, and then like pulled him out of Mexico and brought him to the US. So to me, it's not just a vague generality. It's more, what is the context in which he is producing this art? And the context is that his patron has very direct interest in the geographies in which he's operating. Yeah. And then at what point do individual artists choose to, like, what choices do people make, right? Do you decide like, hey, I'm going to take my revolutionary message to the New Yorkers or to the people of Detroit, or am I going to stay here with the people and do the work I'm doing, which is create these big public murals? And then he does come back later.
Right. But I think the thing for me though is that Diego Rivera, I would say a sincere artist who, like Kenny, said in early, like into physics, into quantum, into these things because they're cool. That makes sense to me that they would reach out to him versus Orozco, right? It makes sense to me that with an artist who believes that this world of the miniature that is being exposed by capitalist technology, but who thinks there's something amazing in it and who's thinking there's something possible in it. I can understand how agents of the state would say, you're the right guy for this job as we go do this. It doesn't necessarily require a, which I think is implied, like that literally his work is founded on undermining these movements of people. The people who want to do that can find the proper vehicles for that. And I think Diego Rivera, as a socialist who thinks that all these things are magical and can be used for good, I can see how they can use such a person.
The richest people in the world.
Right, but I can see how they could use such a person to do harm.
Yeah, they knew who they were looking for, I think.
It kind of brings me back to my reality, like in San Francisco with fellow organizers. The organizers that get the most audience, and whose voices are, amplified, tend to be the ones chosen by the powers that we're fighting. There's some organizers here that, who started similarly. They now have platforms, but they're working with like the Wells Fargo. They're working with Old Navy, and people, again, think they're radical. But again, the way I see it is just like you mentioned, they're chosen to undermine, the more radical aspects of, what people are trying to do.
But they're not like these people. They weren't created in the lab by Wells Fargo. These are people that Wells Fargo, they observe and say, oh, we could use this. Like, we see this voice. We see this voice influencing others. This is a voice that ultimately I think we could utilize if we can amplify it, and we could use it for our aims. It's not like, that's the problem. It's like sometimes I think people are thinking of these folks as created by our opponents, but they're not. They're actually, like me and you, sincere in wanting to change these things and don't recognize when they've crossed a threshold we didn't even know we crossed, from fighting the system to being used by it.
And I think that's, again, the job of us, the people here, is to bring those people, because I don't think, like, for example, the people I'm talking about in our community in San Francisco, they're not, I don't think they mean harm. They actually think they're doing well, but they are not part of the conversation. They're isolated and used as tokens, just like, the people in Imperial Africa, right? Like the ones chosen to direct those societies that were to be formed anew. So I agree that they're not just created in the lab; they are chosen, but yet they are counter-revolutionary. And so they do have free will. And I'm not, same with the leaders of countries, right? Like, I'm not a person that's going to be like, just saying, oh, it's just all the U.S. No, the ruling classes are complicit in this, but there is also power dynamic as to who gets to choose, who gets amplified, and to be the voice of the people.
Well, but I want to say, I'm going to go a little further. I'm going to put me on the block and say that my soul is it's not just Diego Rivera whose soul is up on the scales. My soul is on the scales. On Friday, I've got a trial. And on Friday, the district may say to me, you know what? Well, you can stay alive in this game. We're willing to, if you sign on the dotted line, we'll just put this on written. We won't put it in data form. We'll put it in written form. We'll keep your information about your vaccination status in your file as written form, not on a smart sheet. Will that work? And Eduardo, you and I have already talked that through. I say I'm going to do that. Of course, I say I'm going to do that because I can fight later in the struggle. But possibly, I've actually already crossed the line. Possibly, once I've signed that piece of paper and put it in there, I've become essentially Diego Rivera for the CIA, working down to fuck up the Mexican Revolution. I just don't know it. And that's the thing I'm talking about, is that this is the world we live in. Like, we are faced with all sorts of assaults. We're trying to figure out how to navigate in the context of it. What thing is a compromise where our soul has been sold? What thing is a compromise where the struggle continues? What thing is a compromise we can't possibly make? And I don't think people know those answers to those questions. I'll fucking tell you, I don't know the answer to that question, because I'm going to face that shit possibly Friday. Frankly, I don't think I'm going to face it because I think they want to can my ass. So I'm not even going to face it. But if I do face it, That question, I don't have an answer to that question. I'm going to find out once I do it, and then we see what happens. Do I actually play a role that I hope to play in stopping vaccinations of students and things like that, or organizing my colleagues? Or did I actually cross a line that essentially makes me no longer even worth listening to because I cut a deal with the district who we know is the enemy? So I don't know. I get frustrated. That's what I'm going to say, because people feel like it's so fucking easy, and it isn't easy. And I know you're not saying that, Kenny, and I know you're not saying that, Allison, but that's where sometimes the rewriting of history from these sorts of things sometimes annoys me, because it takes out all the fucking compromises and decisions people had to make who actually were struggling for it, when they're trying to live, and they are fighting with, a system that's trying to kill them. That stakes aren't as high for me on Friday, but anyway.
I mean, but realistically, he is choosing to work with the most elite, powerful class to develop it. I mean, it's not just a small thing. So, and it's not just random. Like, these are people who are doing business in the geography that he was in. So I mean, I'm just going to sort of walk through some other, he spent 15 years in Europe, right? So 1907, 08, go to Europe, learn some things, right? And I don't know exactly how he supports himself during this whole time, but he experiments with a lot of different things with Cubism. And I would say in the early modern period, this idea of the metaphysical, right? Like material reality. I think, to me, Cubism and modern art, and the idea that reality may not be exactly how we see it, or there are different elements, that's an important part of the story, because later on in the murals, the Cubism stuff all goes away, but he was experimenting with that. Like, what is reality when you're working in Cubism? What is reality when you're, a Rosicrucian, or working in the sort of, Kandinsky, like early modern Kabbalistic, spiritual sided, like, what is really real? What is spiritual? What is material? How do you express it? Like, to me, that feels really important. Now, he was there a long time. He was there for 15 years. Like I said, he had multiple kids by several women. I mean, he spent a lot of time, the modern art movement and the abstract art movement was coming out of a spiritual practice, something that was beyond the material. So this is theosophy, but looking at Kandinsky, Mondrian, all of these movements are going on at the same time. So to look at his heroic, very detailed work, I think it's important to remember his early origins were in the Cubist, modernist, abstract frame. And then, so in 1919, he met Siqueiros, who was the third well-known muralist, and they talked about the need for this new, unique Mexican style of art based on the pre-Columbian cultures. And then they traveled together, or no, they didn't travel, but Rivera went through Italy. So that's the whole fresco premise, was he picked it up in Italy, and then went back to Mexico to do this. But it says, whatever, he broke all contact with his friends, girlfriends, and children after 14 years. So, I'm just saying, if part of this is being the good person, right? This is someone who can go establish relationships, have children, and then just walk away and then go back and do some other thing, right? This is the kind of guy he is, right? For better or for worse. You can decide if that's somebody you would want to be in a relationship with, but that's part of his backstory. And so he went back, and it's interesting because this first mural, which was called Creation, I guess, and I thought that it got destroyed, but maybe not. I think this is actually it. It's quite mystical. It's not abstract, not cubist. Mm-hmm. I would say very much more in alignment with sort of a mystical Rosicrucian-y kind of ideal. And so he's very diverse. He has many different approaches to his artwork. And yeah, so this says, I thought it was destroyed, but it says La Creación in San Ildefonso. So this is his earliest muralist type of work, which is unique. And then this is the slide where I say in 1927, so he was invited as a member of the Mexican Communist Party to go to Russia and for the October Revolution. But as you said, like Andy mentioned before, it didn't work out that well. And so I guess my question in some of this is, I don't know how much time, like in his time in Paris and his time in Italy, that he was really involved in communist socialist thought or philosophy. I mean, it sounds like whatever it was, it didn't manifest in the way he had thought. And it said that this is from, I think, the Museum of Modern Art, but that like his whole 9 months, he had some watercolors, which to me, if it was like, really big, he would have, done more. This was out of the MoMA exhibit. And so here at the bottom, it says Abby Aldrich Rockefeller bought the sketchbook from, this is like the irony, right? Like he goes to Russia with the communists and the Rockefellers buy his sketchbook to fund his trip to New York later. So that it's an interesting like use of art as a commodity, right? As a point of leverage. Now, whether, it's like, let me make an offer you can't refuse. Especially if the Rockefellers are tight with Veracruz, where he's from, it's like, well, you can either be our star or we can bury you, like maybe that was the offer that was made. I don't know, but clearly very impressive people. So
yeah, I don't see, like, to me, Diego Rivera just seems like, if you will, a sincere artist who's driven by his passions, his love of the material world, his sense of possibility of it. Obviously, the spiritual side. He was an atheist, right? But then he would get into the Rosicrucian stuff,
yeah.
And but I think even Orozco was like, he recognized that Diego Rivera, he called him an outright opportunist in terms of, being the person who was trying to like essentially monopolize the fresco world and find all the best opportunities for putting his stuff up on people's walls and create a series of acolytes underneath him who would then all praise him. So that's something Orozco recognized in Diego Rivera, and I think that sort of character, as Eduardo knows, in our own union with our current vice president, that kind of character who's a person who is moved by the socialist spirit, if you will, but can be turned quite easily into opportunism without the person necessarily knowing when that switch happened. And we see it time and time and time again. If you look at our trade union movement and you look at the leaders right now in our trade union movement, you'll see it rife with reds, all of them, and anarchists as well. And they're all doing it into the same thing, which is, if I get there, I can do more good up there, and I can sprinkle down revolution from below. And what happens is they get transformed. They become essentially, tools again of the machine itself. And so that's how these ideas get turned on their heads to the rest of us when these socialist leaders speak the words of our capitalist masters out of their mouth without having to ever. You don't even know when they sold their soul. It's just part of that process.
Well, I know it's getting late. Let me click through a couple. So, again, just going back that, they helped, Trotsky, come to Mexico. And I think eventually they were there for a while, and then that relationship a bit sour. And then Cisqueiros, I think, was the one that tried to assassinate Trotsky unsuccessfully. And it got pinned on Rivera, and he fled the country. But, I think Cisqueiros was the one who was like the hardcore communist. Like Rivera never measured up to this expectation. And then he almost gets have a murder pinned on him.
Although people are kind of wondering if he might have been helping out on the side, right? Like, there's been some people who think Diego Rivera might have been not as in opposition to it as people imagine. So,
I don't know. Well, the guy was having an affair with his wife too at some point. Although they were all sleeping around a lot. Who knows if it was tantric sex or whatever, but there was a lot, there's a lot going on there. But so there's a lot of drama around it, but I guess my question is still somewhat on with Rivera is how much of it was a deeply philosophical understanding of socialist politics, and how much of it was part of his larger persona, because he seemed to sort of fall in and out of those circles depending on where he was in his trajectory.
I just want to quickly say people can visit the Si Quiero Studio Museum in Cuernavaca, where I grew up by.
Oh, cool.
Yeah,
Wow.
they can go visit. It's an exclusive.
But I think it's also just remember, like, if I understand the alternatives at that point, you're essentially, okay, they were anarchists, but you were either a Stalinist or a Trotskyist. And the Stalinists, that might seem like a bad word. That was just the Communist Party, like that was the apparatus you were part of at that time. If you wanted to be a trade union activist fighting against racism in the South, you were a communist. Like, that's what you did, and that's in the 30s. So, but all these politics are. And that's true. This is true for the Stalinists, the Communist Party, but this is also true for the Trotskyists. All of them see this through the lens of productivity of the Soviet Union. If there's high level of productivity in the Soviet Union, that's a step forward for socialism. That's a step forward for the revolution. And so everyone's caught in that matrix, like everyone. Maybe there were some anarchists who weren't. And like, I think of some people in the workers' opposition in 1919 who were killed and died, who weren't for Lenin or Trotsky, but wanted another way to renew the revolution that happened in 1917. Maybe there were some folks there who had an independent path. But pretty much by 1921, everyone's caught under the web of some version of thinking that the Soviet Union is some version of socialism, some version of a worker state, even if it's got some problems with it, and that its advancement in of itself is an advancement for the revolutionary cause of workers. And so everyone's trapped in that view. So that's hegemonic. There was no other view that I know of that's ever survived, that's been written down from that time, that where somebody said, you know what, neither this nor that, but this. And
he was also Rosicrucian at the time too, right?
Right.
Until in the 50s, they were like, dude, what were you doing with that? So like, he was balancing these two things.
Right, but just to say that the defeat of the Russian Revolution, and I still would say there was a period for me, at least, in which that did represent the beginnings of liberation. But the fact that thing went away from liberation and became something else, that hung on every revolutionary in the United States and around the world for the remainder of the 20s and 30s. And people didn't know what to do except to say, well, am I against this revolution? Am I for this revolution? It's what people do with Cuba sometimes now. And so it represented a puzzle that a lot of people couldn't get their minds out of.
I haven't read the whole biography. I mean, this was a biography of him where they were saying that his colleagues in Mexico were like, he's the guy that's working with all the big capitalists. So like the questions were there, I would assume that's, and, he was dinner partying with the Fords, that was his trajectory. So these are more about specific painting. So maybe this would be the time to take a break, and then we can come back to it if you guys are up for it. Like the more specific analysis.
I was thinking the same thing, which is this would be a good endpoint, and then but we need to proceed because there's some really interesting stuff that goes on after that.
Yeah, I'm sorry it took, I'm not a good judge of length, and I don't mean to dominate all of your shows, but really.
We need
what do you think? I mean, I think he's really interesting. I mean, this story is fascinating.
Yeah. For me, this is kicking up a lot of questions, and that I don't have answers to. Like, just straight up, that's what comes up for me.
Well, why don't we continue this discussion in a part 2 of this this specific on Diego Rivera? So is this a good place for us to pause? No,
I appreciate your flexibility, guys.
No, I appreciate everyone's flexibility here.
Thank you for your work. This is a lot.
Yeah, and I want to get to this stuff because there's some other pictures that I think are so cool to get to, and already this has already done more to open my mind up about things than I thought it would do. So I want to continue on in this vein.
I have a number of people who are really interested in this conversation. So I'm excited to be able to have it and share it out because you guys are awesome conversationalists.
Two socialists here.
Well, I mean, and you have like background there. I guess I didn't fully appreciate that because I'm just sort of blundering in and making sort of leaps into the stuff that I know about. But yeah, it's been a really nice conversation.
Yeah, well, that's what works for me about this is you're familiar with socialism, but that's not what's animating what your creations are. That's not animating your creations, and that has animated my political creations in my mind. But in coming into contact with the way you're doing it, it's forcing me to open up and think about, okay, what still holds of what I believe, but what needs to just be like kind of relooked at. And that's what's challenging about this, but it's what I enjoy about it.
Well, knowing your professional background better about the micro, I can see how it was really hard. I respect your willingness to look into it or reconsider it. So none of us have the answers either. All right.
Well, let's conclude here, and then we will continue the discussion on Monday. And I appreciate Alison having come on here. So that does it for this week's episode. Part 2 of this discussion will continue on until next week, and we will have that discussion with Alison. Alison McDowell, as I had said in the intro, is a blogger. She's a researcher. She's a mother, and she studied everything in her effort in trying to figure out how public education was being slowly being taken over by technocratic educational technologies and harvesting data. You can find Alison's work at Wrenching the Gears. We will link that in the episode notes, and we expect to have more lively discussions with Alison about other topics as well. So check us out for that. Always transforming this, what's left. All right. So What's Left is a weekly political podcast that's channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests in the episode notes where we found this episode, or on our blog at what-s-left.webnode.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast channel there and connect with us. If you like anything you've heard here, please subscribe to share your favorite episode, subscribe, rate, review to our podcast, Spotify, on Spotify, iTunes Podcast, Stitcher, Google Play, or on BitChute, Odyssey, ODYSEE, YouTube, or Telegram. And if you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-host Andy Lipson and Kenny Cepeda. Thank you all very much. Alison, a pleasure. Thank you for joining us. Ciao.